Chapter 1324 Handling. After staring at the deck below, Katlia left the captain's cabin and walked to the cabin's entrance. She waited until Frank Lee carried a bucket of alcohol-free beer over. "Captain, do you want a cup?" Frank raised the large bucket of beer with one hand. Katlia shook her head firmly and asked in a seemingly casual manner, "Is this the will of the benevolent mother?" "No," Frank said rather seriously. "I just feel that drinking liquor that has been altered by a modified sedative isn't good for the body. I hope that they'll be able to accept this drink that has no alcohol inside, other than the smell of alcohol. Of course, this is only a preliminary result and it doesn't involve liquor. After all, it can't use distillation to enhance its taste." Katlia was momentarily at a loss for words as she nudged the heavy glasses on her nose bridge. After 2 seconds of silence, she said, "Do you hear the benevolent mother's voice or divine epiphanies?" "No." Frank didn't think much of it as he shook his head. "Phew." Katlia secretly heaved a sigh of relief. At that moment, Frank casually added, "The benevolent mother's will is in the ears of the wheat, in the milk of cows, in the growth of mushrooms, and in every corner of nature. One can feel it without the need to experience the divine epiphany." Katlia's gaze immediately shot towards Frank's eyes. She didn't find any signs of madness, only pureness. Without another word, she nodded slightly and walked forward. She crossed Frank Lee and arrived on the deck. After taking in the sea's vista for a few minutes, Katlia returned to the captain's cabin. She unfolded a letter and wrote, "I wonder what's your take regarding Frank's actions. He claims that he doesn't obtain any divine epiphanies, and believes that the benevolent mother's will is hidden in every nook and cranny of nature." This was a letter to Gairman Sparrow. Katlia believed that just by adding such a question, he would be able to understand what she was implying. After folding the letter, she took out a gold coin and began to summon the terrifying messenger. "Ma'am Hermit wrote me a letter immediately after the tarot gathering ended. It shouldn't be related to the hidden sage. It can't be that fast." Klein was on a cruise ship, traveling on the Tussock River. Wearing a black robe, he took the letter from Miss Messenger's mouth and opened it. He finished reading all the content with a glance. "This." Klein frowned slightly. Perhaps it was because Frank had shown enough danger and madness in his usual behavior that he had actually neglected the possibility of this druid being affected by the mother goddess of depravity. Frank had once been placed on trial by the Church of Earth Mother for a forbidden experiment, and then he was placed on a wanted list. If Earth Mother hadn't been corrupted, and the Church of Earth's operations were rather normal, then it means that they believe that Frank is problematic. However, if there's concrete evidence, Frank, who went to the court, probably wouldn't have lived. Klein's mind raced as he attempted to find clues based on his understanding of Frank. There's no problem with the relevant actions. The prayer posture and his usual prayer gestures are different. It's just like how when the Beyonders of the Church of Evernight pray, they won't draw 4 stars on their chests at times. At most, they'll just go through the final motions. Apart from this small problem, there's something wrong with Frank in every aspect. He's like a child raised by the mother goddess of depravity. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein had 2 contradictory guesses. Either Frank's corruption was very hidden, making it impossible for the Church of Earth Mother's tribunal to be certain, or he wasn't affected by the mother goddess of depravity at all. It was purely because he had a mental problem that made him look like a blessed of an evil god. Regardless of which guess it was, Klein believed that the subsequent development wouldn't be good. He remembered very clearly that Frank's mushroom experiment had a breakthrough because he had been given an assistant who believed in the primordial moon. And the primordial moon was one of the manifestations of the mother goddess of depravity. That also meant that from that moment forth, regardless of whether Frank had any problems in the past, he could very well have entered the eyes of the mother goddess of depravity. This wasn't a good thing. Of course, I can't eliminate the possibility that Frank is excessively crazy, causing the mother goddess of depravity to just look away. Klein mumbled in amusement, hoping to make the best out of it. This was nearly impossible. The horror and strength of a foreign god wasn't something a demigod could understand. Klein even suspected that if it wasn't for the overly intense response that would destroy the anchors of the deities, allowing them to attack each other in a frenzy, resulting in the Beyonder characteristics to gather and awaken the oldest one, the outer deities might have already destroyed the sun and destroyed the ecosystem of the world. They weren't able to do anything to the oldest one's barrier, but they were free to do anything to the star outside the barrier. Sometimes, Klein wondered if the astronomically observed sun was real or not. Perhaps it was just the eternal blazing sun that hung himself there. So far, there shouldn't be any major problems with the mushrooms that Frank invented. I've already dealt with them above the gray fog. Furthermore, the residents of the city of Silver and Moon City didn't show any abnormalities. Yes, after they left the forsaken land of the gods, they abandoned farming mushrooms because they lacked monster corpses and had sufficient food. The more Klein thought about it, the more fearful he felt towards it. If it wasn't for the fact that the mother goddess of depravity's powers that could penetrate the original barrier was still extremely limited, Klein suspected that the cards of blasphemy and mushrooms would have left him corrupted. Sapphira Castle would have unknowingly changed owners. These were things that had been placed above the gray fog for a long time and didn't undergo any special sealing. Compared to the flamboyant mother tree of desire, the usually low-key mother goddess of depravity was far more terrifying. Mr. Dor and the Emperor were silently corrupted by her. As expected of an existence that stands atop the outer deities despite losing 2 Beyonder pathways and a Sapphira. Klein sighed inwardly. He took out a pen and paper and prepared to write a reply to Katlia. At that moment, he realized that Miss Messenger had been waiting by his side the entire time without returning to the spirit world. The 8 eyes of the 4 heads stared at him unblinkingly. What do you think of Frank? Klein hesitated before asking, other than his nickname. The 4 heads in Rionette Tinker's hands spoke one after another. He only appears like an adopted son of an outer deity. In other words, Frank wasn't affected by the mother goddess of depravity previously. He was simply crazy. Klein heaved a long sigh of relief. He then asked, what about now? As Frank Lee summoned Rionette Tinker every time he wrote a letter to Gehrman Sparrow, Klein believed that Miss Messenger, who had a very high status, had a relatively clear and accurate grasp of the state of the Mushroom King. I don't know either, Rionette Tinker's 4 heads answered one after another. Following that, she added, his body, temporarily, hasn't been corrupted. Does that mean that you can't tell if his psyche is affected? That's right, other than his low level, Frank's usual actions resemble more of an evil god than me. Klein lampooned as he took out a gold coin and flicked it. With this medium, he quickly entered a dream divination state. At the same time, he was prepared to activate Sapphira Castle to cut off the outer deities from watching. Scenes flashed past as Klein saw several futures. Yes, the greatest threat right now is that primordial moon believer. I have to separate him from Frank, or things will become extremely troublesome and dangerous. If Frank doesn't come into contact with anything related to the mother goddess of depravity in the future and doesn't advance to a demigod, there shouldn't be any problems. If only one of these 2 conditions is satisfied, the chance of an accident happening will increase greatly. If both are satisfied at the same time, I can't see the developments at all. Klein snapped awake as he interpreted the results of the divination. Perhaps because Frank's level was too low, and he wasn't too affected by it, Klein's divination happened smoothly without encountering any danger. Phew. He silently exhaled and caught the gold coin. Then, he realized that Miss Messenger's 8 red eyes were focused on the gold coin in his palm. Klein twitched his eyebrows, expressing his doubts. It has Sapphira Castle's aura. Rionette Tinker's 4 blonde, red-eyed heads shook up and down. This is one of the 5 gold coins I often use for divination. It has already been tainted by the aura of Sapphira Castle. This way, it can be considered a mystical item to a certain extent. However, the effect will be drained over time. Klein carefully looked at the gold coin in his hand and made a rough judgment based on his spiritual intuition. This gold coin could increase the accuracy of divination and enhance a user's ability to resist any interference. To Klein, this was a pleasant surprise. He decided to use the actual gold coin rather than its historical projection. Retrieving the gold coin, Klein wrote a reply to Mam Hermit and handed it to her through Rionette Tinker. After giving Gehrman Sparrow's messenger another gold coin, Katlia unfolded the letter and quickly scanned it. After reading it, she felt her shoulders weigh down a little. Without any delay, Katlia took out another piece of paper and wrote, "Your Majesty, I dreamed of you finding that primitive island and successfully returning. The situation of that descendant of the Emperor is getting worse. If he continues staying on the future, I suspect he'll go crazy. If you don't mind, I want to send him over to you. What we need to take note of is that, although he claims to no longer believe in the primordial moon, no one has ever confirmed that. My greatest worry now is that it's difficult to obtain the main ingredient of a clairvoyant. If you have returned, I wish to find a time to return the magic wishing lamp to you." Chapter 1325. More than half a year later, City of Generosity, Biyao, in a rented apartment lit up with gas lamps. Verdun Abraham, who was wearing a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, held a thick stack of information. He was reading seriously under the dim light, drawing a symbol and recording what he deemed useful information from time to time. He left Lone and came to the Rørsted archipelago mainly to avoid being watched by Dorian and his other family members, and focus on studying mysticism. He wanted to find an effective way to save ancestor Bethel Abraham, or rather, reduce the difficulty of the known ritual. However, he hadn't made any headway after half a year. It was as though he had no other choice other than hunting a bizarro sorcerer, a parasite, and a secret sorcerer. This made Verdun rather depressed, but he was clear about how dangerous a Grade 0 sealed artifact was. Even if he was willing to sacrifice himself, he was unable to truly control it. He was unable to guarantee the final outcome. And the most important thing was that he couldn't find any bizarro sorcerers or parasites. They were all saints that were hard to track, with styles that were known for being strange and bizarre. Phew. Verdun put down the stack of documents in his hand and muttered silently, "Don't tell me I can only place my hopes on the fool like Dorian and the others?" Upon thinking of the fool, Verdun couldn't help but frown. This was because there were more and more half-giants promoting the fool's faith in Biyao City, so much so that even he, who rarely went out, heard of it. This made him suspect if he had arrived near the headquarters of the Church of the Fool. If it wasn't for the mysterious knowledge that was spread in secret in the Rørsted archipelago was far beyond Verdun's expectations. Many of them were things that the Abraham family didn't know of, and were extremely useful. He would have left Biyao last month and headed for the southern continent. "I can't stay here any longer. I need to buy ship tickets to East Balam as soon as possible." Just as Verdun made a decision, he began to waver. "Dorian and the fool probably wouldn't expect me to hide in the area that's under their headquarters jurisdiction. Emperor Roselle once said that the most dangerous place is the safest place." After some hesitation, Verdun put down the documents and switched off the lights. With the moonlight from the window, he walked towards the bedroom. At the corner of the balcony in his room, a figure suddenly jumped out of the darkness and jumped over the railings. The figure was like a feather, light and weightless. It landed from a height 10 meters above the ground, without making a single sound. Right on the heels of that, the figure moved through the shadows to the vicinity of the Church of the Sea God and went up the bell tower. Then, he took out a pen and paper and wrote the report on tonight's surveillance before stuffing it into a crack. After the figure left, a howling wind suddenly sounded above the bell tower about 15 minutes later. The report was pulled out from the crack by an invisible hand. As it swept through the wind, it rose and fell into the distance like a bat spreading its wings in the dark night. Not long after, the report plummeted like it had been bound to a rock, landing on a hand that extended out in a hidden corner of the garden. This hand belonged to the Cardinal of the Church of Storms, Alger Wilson. He then unfolded the report and began to read it in the darkness. He was completely unaffected by the lack of light. Even in the dark sea, Alger could see everything around him clearly. Verdun is becoming more resolute in his intention of leaving Biyao. Alger nodded indiscernibly as he came to a conclusion. Over the past half a year, he had been monitoring this member of the Abraham family according to Mr. Fool's instructions, but he hadn't noticed anything abnormal about him. After Verdun left the Rorstad archipelago, his mission would be completed. However, Alger didn't wish for it to end just like that. He believed that he hadn't made enough contributions. All he did was simply monitor a sequence 7 Beyonder without any special characteristics. The hermit had already obtained a sequence 3 Beyonder characteristic from Queen Mystic, and had gathered the corresponding supplementary ingredients and was busy preparing the ritual. This made Alger deeply stressed. Of course, he had also done many things according to Mr. Fool's intentions, but even he felt that there was a huge difference from doing those tasks, with the identity, status, and strength of Sea God. For a moment, Alger wanted to use all sorts of methods to force Verdun Abraham to expose himself, but in the end, he gave up on the idea. This was because he couldn't be sure of Mr. Fool's attitude towards the target. Previously, when the City of Silver and Moon City sold Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas, Alger had purchased some from the Tarot Club. He had used it to secretly nurture a team of Beyonders who were loyal to him. This was how he had people monitoring Verdun. Currently, this less than 10-member team was mostly at Sequence 9, while only a small number of them had been promoted to Sequence 8. As for where Alger had obtained the money for purchasing Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas, the answer was very simple. As a cardinal of the church diocese, Alger could easily save a sum of money for himself. And during that period of time, the minerals, farms, spice plantations, and factories in the Rorstad archipelago were sold at below intrinsic value. As long as one had the funds to buy them, they could earn a lot after a short period of time. More importantly, the Church of Storm's headquarters was quite interested in the Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas sold by the City of Silver and Moon City. They provided a large sum of money for their purchase. The go-between was without a doubt the Cardinal of the Rorstad Diocese, Alger Wilson. It was understandable that some losses were inevitable during such situations. Reining in his thoughts, Alger decided to sell some mysticism knowledge in Biyam's Beyonder circles through his shadow guards. He wanted to bait Verdun Abraham and keep him in the vicinity for as long as possible. The main reason is that the City of Silver's preaching has frightened that gentleman. Alger shook his head and muttered inwardly. He then destroyed the report in his hand and walked back into the cathedral. The sky had just lit up, and a young man walked out of the hotel, leisurely enjoying the scenery of Biyam's morning. He had just bought the Tina beverage that was packaged with the fruit's shell when he suddenly felt a huge shadow appear beside him. The youth turned his head and looked up bit by bit only to find a 2.5-meter tall half-giant walking over. "Excuse me, sir, do you have a moment to talk about our Lord and Savior, Mr. Fool?" The half-giant bent his back and tried his best to make his smile appear amiable. The youth drank a mouthful of Tina and pointed to the side. He smiled and nodded. "Sure, but not here." He then walked to a place where they wouldn't be in the way. The seemingly oppressive half-giant followed warmly. "Go ahead." The youth didn't hide his curiosity at all. The muscular half-giant's expression turned solemn. "My lord claims to be the Fool. In the past, the present, and also in the future, he is the great ruler who dominates the spirit world. He is also the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. He is also the landmark when every living being seeks eternal life. My lord lives above the real world and the spirit world. His benevolence spreads across heaven and the land. There are a total of 6 angels under him. The angel of Mercury is the embodiment of fate, my lord's most cherished angel. The angel of death has followed my lord for the longest period of time and is the consul of the underworld. The angel of redemption is my lord's bugle, the messenger of his revelations. The angel of life is the crystallization of wisdom itself. She is the indestructible spirituality that resides in everyone's body. Upon hearing that, the youth laughed. Your lord is really impressive. He actually has so many angels to serve him. Not only that, the half-giant replied gently. There's also the angel of retribution beside the Lord's throne. He is the Lord's lightning, the Lord's rage, and the Lord's palm. It's all the judge of the fallen and the ones who aren't chaste. In contrast to the angel of retribution is the angel of time. He is a king of ancient times. He eventually submitted to my lord and now strikes the bell of heaven. Impressive, impressive. The youth sincerely sighed. Upon hearing such a response, the half-giant couldn't help but smile. Then, he described the various miracles that Mr. Fool had performed as succinctly as possible. Finally, he said, "It's already been 15 minutes. I won't waste your time. If you're interested, you can go to the Fool's Cathedral on 16th Phillip Street. This is the biggest cathedral in Biyao City." Heh, the rest are still in planning. The young man nodded. "I'll pay a visit if I'm free." After watching the half-giant turn and leave, the youth took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and wore it on his right eye. The half-giant walked straight back to a restaurant and changed into a chef's attire. "Baldur, you went proselytizing again?" the restaurant owner asked with a smile. When the industry association recommended this half-giant to learn culinary skills from his restaurant, he had been rather reluctant. He always felt that the other party could kill him with just a swing of his arm, and he didn't seem like someone with any culinary talent. However, he was now very pleased with Baldur. Not only was he humble, obedient, and willing to take hardship, he had quite the intimidating demeanor. This scared off the gangsters who had placed their sights on the restaurant. The only problem was that he would go out every morning to proselytize the fool. Of course, the restaurant owner couldn't say anything since it wasn't working hours, so he didn't mind. Baldur smiled honestly and walked into the kitchen. He said to his good friend, Bon, who had come from Moon City to seek refuge with him, "I can teach you how to roast fish today." Bon looked rather normal, but his eyes appeared awkward with one looking up and the other looking down. He was one of the citizens from Moon City who wasn't very deformed, and he had the courage to interact with the people outside. He nodded. "I have to pray in a moment." Mr. Fool sent a revelation to get all the residents of Moon City to pray to him at 9 in the morning. We are to wish that we are no longer deformed. Chapter 1326 Successful Mass. Regarding the matter of praying to Mr. Fool, Baldur raised both hands and feet in agreement. He didn't have any intention of pressing Bon. He prayed for more than a minute after waking up in the morning and before sleeping at night. He would thank Mr. Fool for bringing the pure sunlight, delicious food, and a life of no despair. "All right, I'll prepare the ingredients for today first." Baldur smiled as he nodded at Bon. A few minutes later, he brought many bags of ingredients into the kitchen, as if he was carrying a few rolls of curtains. At this moment, Bon found a chair and sat down. He sincerely prayed to Mr. Fool. "The great ruler who controls the spirit world, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, I wish to be blessed by you. I hope that you can fulfill my wish of escaping from my deformity, in the cathedral on Phillip Street, in several areas in Biyao, in the new city of Silver, and the new Moon City that was located in a forest." Prayers echoed softly simultaneously. The extremely self-conscious Exian, Russ, and company vaguely guessed that Mr. Fool was planning on granting such a wish. As they prayed, their bodies trembled, unable to control themselves. They yearned to be like normal people. They were also looking forward to the bustling and lively Biyao. They yearned for the grilled fish made from a secret recipe, the candy factories, and delicacies from all over the world. They yearned for a life to drink, chat, sing, and dance. In the ancient palace above the grey fog, the fool Klein, who was sitting at the end of the long bronze table, saw bits of pure light light up one after another, forming a majestic sea of stars in front of him. The prayers overlapped and echoed inside Sapphira Castle as ripples appeared. Klein closed his eyes and took it in for a few seconds. He raised his right hand and bent his middle finger, wrapping the edge of the long model table. An invisible force spread out like waves on the surface of water. It surged into every prayer point of light and landed on the residents of Moon City. Exian suddenly felt something and raised her hand to touch the middle of her face. The next second, she felt her nose. Almost instinctively, Exian stroked that position several times from top to bottom before she believed she had grown a nose and was no longer deformed. She instantly closed her eyes, bent down, and pressed her forehead to the ground. She couldn't help but praise Mr. Fool. The praises around her grew louder and louder, becoming more and more uniform. Russ's eyes separated, Bond's eyes became symmetrical, and in Moon City, every deformed person, or those who were ugly because of the traits they inherited, had broken through their original restrictions and their bodies were transforming towards a state of normalcy. At this moment, be it in New Moon City, the new city of silver, or Biyao, they heard the bell of the cathedral ring. Gong! The ethereal gong of the bell reverberated in the hearts of everyone in Moon City. It rang in the ears of every person who heard it, as though it could cleanse their souls and bring them the most genuine feelings towards life. The tears that Exian, Russ, and company held back finally flowed out. They felt their minds and bodies turn tranquil, no longer having a speck of dust tainting them. They subconsciously raised their heads and cast their gaze towards the source of the gong. They discovered that it came from beyond New Moon City, an unknown distance away from where they were. A miracle. A thought suddenly popped into the minds of the Moon City citizens. In the new city of silver that was connected to them, Wade Chermont and company cast their gazes into the distance and cast their gaze towards Biyao. The gong came from there. Praise Mr. Fool. They mumbled at the same time as they pressed their right palm to their left chest. In Biyao City, Bon adjusted his postures with Baldur, who had tears streaming down his face. They faced Phillip Street and towards the cathedral that belonged to Mr. Fool. They listened attentively and gratefully to the holy chimes from heaven. However, above the grey fog, the Fool Klein was somewhat astonished and confused. The sudden chiming of the bells wasn't within his plans. He then turned his gaze to the Fool's Cathedral at 16 Phillip Street. Almost at the same time, he used the prayer lights to see the tall bell tower that was attached to the cathedral. He saw a young man wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe standing at the top of the bell tower. This youth was holding a black bell hammer and was striking the bell repeatedly. As if sensing the gaze from above, the youth stopped. He lifted his head slightly and adjusted the crystal monocle on his right eye. At the same time, his smile widened. Klein nearly cursed. At this moment, his eyes glazed over almost in an unconcealed manner. He didn't understand why Angel of Time Amon would suddenly appear and seriously strike the bell of his cathedral. Klein was actually mentally prepared for Amon's and Zeradal's possible arrival. This was because there were just too many people in the City of Silver and Moon City. There was no way they could secretly integrate with the outside world. In other words, the City of Silver and Moon City would definitely be known to the various churches and secret organizations. Under such circumstances, be it public or private proselytizing, it wouldn't affect any future development. Therefore, Klein silently agreed to the City of Silver's attempts to proselytize the faith of the Fool. This was preparation for him to have more anchors for his advancement to Sequence 1. Due to this premise, he was prepared for Zeradal, Amon, and other hidden enemies to come to Biyao. He even hoped that they would do so. Here, Klein, who had the status and level of a king of angels in Sapphira Castle, was able to fully display his home ground advantage. As for the City of Silver, it also had Grade 0 sealed artifacts. It could completely resist Amon and take down Zeradal. Compared to his main body suddenly encountering a prepared enemy elsewhere, or the discovery of his marionette city, this was undoubtedly a better choice. However, Amon's current actions confused Klein. He didn't understand what the god of deceit wanted to achieve. 16 Phillip Street, inside the Fool's Cathedral. The Archbishop on duty, the City of Silver's 6-member council's elder, Derek Berg, also looked up in astonishment at the stained glass. Rays of sunlight shone inside, allowing Derek to read one scene after another. As the black bell hammer fell, the tremors of the bell gradually stopped. I didn't arrange for someone to strike the bell. Derek frowned. As a member of the City of Silver, as a demigod in the Sun domain, he had a sharp intuition and knew that something must have gone wrong. However, the strange ringing of the bell didn't bring any accidents. Besides the ringing, everything seemed normal. As Derek observed the surroundings with the help of his unshadowed beyonder powers, he quickly considered whether the bell had any symbolic significance in mysticism. After eliminating the possibilities, he suddenly recalled the Holy Bible of the Fool made up by the City of Silver. There was content related to the striking of bells. It was used to describe the relationship between Angel of Time Amon and Mr. Fool to confirm his true status. Towards that sentence, Derek was still against it because he knew that blasphemer Amon wasn't Mr. Fool's blessed. Their relationship wasn't even harmonious, and was actually hostile. However, the lies he made previously had convinced the other members of the City of Silver's 6-member council. They believed that Angel of Time Amon was the first entity appointed by Mr. Fool to cast down the light for the people of the forsaken land of the gods. It was because he had parasitized Derek, which had resulted in the subsequent changes, all the way until hope descended. Derek had wanted to explain, but he was embarrassed. That would only bring up too many lies, making him lose his image with the other elders of the 6-member council and citizens of the City of Silver. It was just like Miss Justice had said before, a social death. Finally, he chose to delay any actions, hoping that Mr. Fool would take a look at the Holy Bible. If there was anything inappropriate with the descriptions, he would definitely send a divine revelation to change the views. To his surprise, Mr. Fool didn't say anything and silently agreed with the contents of the Holy Bible. Could it be that Amon is striking the bell? Derek was momentarily dazed as he found it too unbelievable. He hurriedly lowered his head and began praying, reporting this matter to Mr. Fool. Above the gray fog, inside Sapphira Castle. Before Klein could eliminate Amon, the other party suddenly turned transparent and transformed into a beam of light before vanishing from the bell tower. What does this fellow want? If his father is the emperor and not the ancient sun god, then I can reasonably suspect that he is striking a death knell for me. As Klein checked if there were any almonds lurking in the bodies of the City of Silver and Moon City citizens, he analyzed Amon's motives without any clue in mind. Just as he was about to use divination to seek clues, Derek completed his prayer. Holy Bible, Holy Bible? The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he summoned from the junk pile the Holy Bible that the City of Silver had sacrificed to him. Previously, he had only flipped through a few pages, but he was too embarrassed to continue reading it. He took on a position of burying his head in the sand. Of course, he wasn't careless in this aspect. He was still extremely cautious. He used divination inside Sapphira Castle to confirm that the Holy Bible wouldn't bring him any harm. With this premise, he allowed the City of Silver to use this Holy Bible. He slowly took a deep breath and reached out his right hand. He flipped the scriptures page by page. His facial muscles began to twitch, and the corner of his lips uncontrollably parted. Klein flipped faster and faster. Finally, he saw the last page. Pa! Klein suddenly closed the book and threw it back onto the junk pile. After this miracle in Moon City, yes, the potion has mostly been digested. The Marionette City will have to step onto the stage of history. Klein observed his condition without expression and nodded indiscernibly. Ever since he had gained preliminary control of Sapphira Castle, he could receive digestion feedback from the real world. Chapter 1327 3 Plans. As for the Marionette Town, Klein had been thinking about how to build it a long time ago. He had already come up with 3 plans. If he eliminated any interference from external factors, his best choice would be somewhere in a certain country of the northern continent. He would allow his marionette town to rise up overnight. Furthermore, he would connect it to the surrounding cities through railways, rivers, and roads. This way, the marionette town would have large numbers of outsiders arriving on a daily basis, and it would create a very strong interaction with the surrounding areas. On the one hand, a town without a city nearby would definitely purchase grain, salt, cloth, ores, sugar, and other daily necessities. On the other hand, it would also produce its own products, which could be sold to neighboring cities, towns, and villages. Under such a situation, merchants, workers, tourists, and other groups would go back and forth frequently. At the same time, they would interact more with the marionette town's residents. Under the influence of all kinds of interactions between the parties, it wouldn't be long before the town of marionettes could produce a corresponding region in the spirit world. Once the lives of the residents became more detailed and real, Klein could consume the potion to advance to sequence one attendant of mysteries. This would take less than 3 months. But the problem was that this approach couldn't be kept confidential. In the present era, to have a town suddenly pop up was something that couldn't be hidden from people. Soon, there would be civil servants, the police, and reporters coming to investigate. And after that, the interactions between the parties would also make more and more people know and understand the city. This was a problem that couldn't be resolved through illusions unless the town of marionettes didn't interact with the surrounding cities, towns, and villages and had relatively minor interactions. However, that wouldn't meet the requirements of the ritual. When news of the marionette town spread, Klein would undoubtedly be targeted by Zeradal, Amon's true body, and his other enemies. When the time came, the destruction caused by others would definitely be easier than him protecting it. He could only migrate his marionette town elsewhere. This would cause the interactions generated in the early stages to be for naught, just like what the dark demonic wolf had experienced. Therefore, Klein had only listed down such a plan, so he basically wouldn't choose it. Unless a certain visionary was willing to provide help, making all the living beings in the northern and southern continents naturally believe that there was indeed a town there, one that hadn't suddenly appeared. Considering the influence of various external factors and his beyonder powers, Klein's best choice was to establish the town on an uninhabited island that deviated from the safe sea route and was sufficiently well hidden. He would then use Sapphira Castle to give it anti-divination and anti-prophecy properties. At the same time, Klein would use the curtain to graft some roads, rivers, and railways to somewhere outside the marionette town, making it a stop for random groups of people during their journeys. This couldn't be kept completely confidential, but once the strange phenomenon spread and attracted Zeradal's and Amon's attention, Klein could easily remove the original grafting randomly and switch the entrance. Under such a strategy, the movement was limited to the entrance, not the marionette town itself. The effects of various interactions in the spirit world could be preserved without being interrupted. The ritual could steadily proceed as planned. Of course, there was a big problem with this plan. It was that the interaction would be limited and couldn't influence matters at a daily level in all its aspects. In addition, the frequency and intensity of the interaction wouldn't be too high. If he chose this plan, it meant that Klein had to spend more than half a year or even a year on the ritual. If he wanted to be safe, forcing every marionette's fate to have a beginning and an end, the ritual would take at least 50 years. However, there was also a way to get around the limitations. Once the rest of the ritual's requirements were met, he could deliver a meteorite strike, an earthquake, or a volcano eruption to the town, causing all the marionette's fates to come to an end in the real world. It was something that happened in real life and was rather reasonable. In this radical and conservative proposal, Klein had another solution. It was to replicate a city and make the marionette correspond to the residents of the city and be mapped one-to-one. For evil miracle invokers, they could wipe out the original city and use their marionettes to replace its inhabitants. Those who had a kind heart would hide the city and ensure a supply of goods. The reason as to why one didn't convert the target city into marionettes was that it already had a corresponding region in the spirit world. Without being a newly born one, it didn't meet the requirements of the ritual. With the curtain formed by the attendant of mysteries beyonder characteristic, Klein could make a better choice, graft a city at a particular stage to his marionette town. This meant that his town of marionettes had become the dark side of the city. In the corresponding period of time, outsiders would encounter marionettes and not real people. Once that period of time passed, they would leave the town of marionettes and return to the real world to deal with real people. During the process, Klein would send his marionettes to act as an outsider and maintain interactions with the corresponding real person, allowing the real outsiders to return to the real world without any gaps. In other words, there were 2 different lives playing out in the same city at the same time, but no one could notice that. Occasionally, some people would think that some details weren't right, but would find it inexplicable and might just ignore it. This was rather in line with the characteristic of an attendant of mysteries, and it had a certain level of concealment. Of course, this plan also had its problem. It was to simulate the fate of a marionette to a very high level, almost as similar as a human's. Without its own independence, it would cause the ritual's effects to fail. Klein tapped the edge of the long modeled table with his fingers and was in a dilemma over the second and third plan. After a few minutes, he did as his heart willed, cowardice, and chose the second plan. He would rather spend more time than affect the fates of the innocent. Back then, Zeradal and Antigonus likely chose the third plan. Klein sighed and prepared to return to the real world. At this moment, he looked at the junk pile and considered whether he should send a revelation to change the descriptions in the City of Silver's Holy Bible. To a deity, the Holy Bible wasn't anything too important. Its best use was for its convenience to spread its teachings and increase the number of anchors. Klein had long come to a conclusion from the revelation of Evernight, the Book of Storms, and the contents of the various Orthodox churches' holy Bibles. Most of the content elevated the Orthodox deity, making random claims of grandeur and expressed mercy and pity. In ancient times, the impression the believers had of the deities would indeed have a negative impact on the deities. But now, with the use of symbols instead of statues, this latent problem no longer existed. At the very least, the Evernight goddess, the Lord of Storms, and other deities openly declared that they were parts of the Creator's original body. They weren't worried that it would exacerbate the awakening of the oldest one. In other words, if there really was a problem with this aspect, Klein believed that the Evernight goddess would definitely have changed the corresponding description. She would have changed the description of being one of the eyes of the Creator to a child spawned by him. It too enjoyed a very high status. At the same time, the believer's acknowledgement of certain matters wouldn't have any burden on the deities themselves in a mysticism sense. Otherwise, Amon would have secretly helped Klein, or rather, prepare a batch of believers for the former Sapphira Castle to lure them into forming the belief that the Angel of Time was the manifestation of the Lord of the Mysteries. With the aid of an instinctual response that met the requirements, he could establish enough connections with Sapphira Castle and open a back door. To a deity, the Holy Bible only had two important components other than for spreading the faith. Firstly, it was a description of the authority and honorific name of the deities themselves. If there were any mistakes, it would lead to the prayers of the believers pointing to an unknown target. Not only would it be dangerous to the believers, but it would also cause the deities to lose their anchors. Secondly, any descriptions that involved the other churches would easily attract conflict. As for the angels and saints, the deities actually didn't pay them too much mind. The ones that cared were the angels and saints themselves because they needed to obtain a certain level of anchors through this. Therefore, the Holy Bible's descriptions of angels and saints were detailed enough. They had authority in honorific names, making it easier for different believers to choose and be immersed. In addition, this wasn't enough to form a stable anchor, because it was under the faith of a deity. In order to resolve this problem, the Orthodox churches would define certain cathedrals to different guardian angels and guardian saints and clearly differentiate them. Due to this knowledge, Klein didn't pay much attention to the Holy Bible. After he finished reading the description about his authority and honorific name, he stopped continuing out of embarrassment. He only used divination to confirm that the contents wouldn't result in a conflict with the Orthodox churches. After some thought, he gave up the idea of directly sending the revelation to change the Holy Bible and decided to use a gentler method. During the Tarot Club's exchange, he could use the World Gehrman Sparrow to guide the son into adjusting his understanding of the situation, turning the parts involving the Angel of Time to Pallas Zoroast, allowing the corresponding content to be fixed without causing any suspicion in the City of Silver. Biyao, Verdu Abraham had obtained quite a bit of mysticism knowledge in a few Beyonder circles. He lit up the gas wall lamp and carefully read it in the night. Towards the end, he suddenly read a piece of news that he had never understood before. Bansi Harbor is a place filled with mysticism powers. Its connection with the spirit world and the astral world is beyond imagination. Even with the Church of Storms directly destroying the harbor, it still can't completely eliminate the abnormality of its existence. Many mysticism researchers are purchasing items related to Bansi at a high price. Bansi. Verdun muttered to himself silently, suddenly having a strong interest in the harbor. He began considering if he should buy some items from Bansi and do a thorough study of them. After all, the spirit world was related to teleportation. The astral world and the cosmos involved wandering, and might involve Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham's method of escaping. Perhaps, if I have the chance, I could go to Bansi to take a look. Verdun nodded indiscernibly. Chapter 1328. The preparations needed. The initial preparations for building a marionette town were rather boring and tedious. At the very least, Klein believed so. In the ancient palace, Klein sat on the high-back chair belonging to the fool, holding a fountain pen. There were ordinary pieces of paper with the name, age, and the fate of every marionette. As he made the worms of spirit emerge from his body, they formed avatars beside him. Some Klein sat on the ground, while others occupied the 21 seats other than the fool's. Some conjured beds and lay on them. Then, they summoned different books from the junk pile and started reading them seriously. The books included but were not limited to How to Brew Wine, Train Dispatching, Desert Making Compendium, A Clergyman Prepares, Gas Wall Lamps, Gas Meters, and all kinds of family machinery repair, desilicacy, harbor management, foundations of law, ladies' aesthetic magazines. These were specialist knowledge that different marionettes needed to grasp. Only by doing so would they be able to act their roles well, allowing him to be realistic in every aspect. Even if they were to engage in a deep conversation with outsiders, they wouldn't expose any problems. It wouldn't be difficult for Klein if he just needed to simply memorize the knowledge, but he had to truly grasp and apply it. Furthermore, he couldn't confuse his characters. He couldn't let a burly and strong switchman with a low income be talking about the wonders of a particular skincare product, or which silk cloth was flawed. If such a situation were to happen in novels, plays, and operas, it might create a strange attraction, but putting it in the real world was clearly uncanny and not beneficial to the advancement of the ritual. To avoid such a problem, Klein could only work harder in the early stages. He hoped that every character in a marionette town would be real, whole, and appropriate. Fortunately, there weren't many people in a city who needed to deeply understand the corresponding specialist knowledge. Most of the residents were half illiterate, or really illiterate. They relied on experience to live their lives that they repeated via motions. For these characters, the knowledge that Klein needed to grasp was relatively little, just like workers who had gone through simple training, or even without any training, to be sent to the assembly line. After an unknown period of time, Klein put down his fountain pen and rubbed his temples, letting out a long sigh of relief. He had finally written down the information about nearly 5,000 residents in the marionette town, and his corresponding knowledge preparation was almost complete. This is like a super large-scale movie directed by a director, and with me being the scriptwriter. Same for the lighting engineer, the makeup artist, and all the actors. For this ritual, I'm really on the verge of losing control. If I'm not careful, my personality will dissociate and I'll fall into the abyss of madness. Luckily, I have a professional psychologist. Yes, I have to pay attention to a problem in the town's operations. Although I'm a gentleman with manners, most of the residents in town have low socioeconomic status. Be it speaking or acting, they're more inclined towards being vulgar. I can't make a mistake during the acting and become set back by my psychological barriers. Klein sighed silently as the avatars around him disintegrated into worms of spirit before he got them to burrow into his body. Of course, this wasn't all. There was also one, Klein, who maintained his previous state, preparing to be on Sapphira Castle duty. In the next second, Klein returned to the real world and took out creeping hunger from the historical void. Then, he teleported to an island that was located in the Berserk Sea but one that clearly deviated from the safe sea route. This was the stage he had chosen before. This place was isolated from the storms all year round. There were no signs of human activity, only a large forest and animals that lived off the forest. Klein looked around and chose an open area. He pressed his right hand to his left chest and prayed sincerely, "I wish that there's a city suitable for 5,000 people here." Just as he said that, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, this open area became extremely flat. The surrounding forest also receded greatly, providing large amounts of wood, stones, and soil. Almost at the same time, buildings rose up from the ground. They took form with stone and wood. The highest wasn't more than 4 stories high. The style was closer to the Lone Kingdom's Desi Bay. In just the blink of an eye, residential buildings, a library, a police station, a telegraph office, a city hall, a small hospital, a candy factory, a water plant, a gas company, a steam locomotive station, parallel train tracks, and plantations outside the city took form. The streets were also paved with cement or stone bricks. Towards the end, on the square in the middle of the town, a pointed-tip cathedral emerged from the ground and stood proudly. This was a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess, as it was in line with the background setting of the city. I hope this island has a deep-sea harbor. Klein didn't stop as he made a second wish. Pa! He snapped his fingers again, fulfilling his wish. About 3 kilometers away from the town, a small-scale harbor quickly took shape. There were 2 docks, 5 warehouses, a port hotel, a simple restaurant, a police station branch, a bar, a lighthouse, and a naval base. I wish for the harbor and town to have convenient transportation. Klein made a third wish. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. A concrete road and a cargo rail instantly appeared between the town and the harbor. According to Klein's plan, a portion of the harbor was prepared for visitors by sea. The town was mainly for outsiders from the northern and southern continent. As he looked at the empty city with admiration, Klein pressed his top hat and teleported to the municipal square. He walked step by step into the cathedral named St. Ariana Cathedral. The cathedral's door was open, and it was dark inside. After an unknown period of time, 3 figures appeared at the door. They were a 30-year-old gentleman in a formal suit with a tie, an ordinary-looking and gentle-looking woman, and a child who was dressed like an adult. The woman took a few steps with difficulty before stretching her neck. Then, she smiled and reached out her hands to hold the gentleman's arm. The gentleman had a faint smile on his face. As he allowed the lady to lean on him, he reached out his right hand and held the boy. The little boy was skipping about, appearing very lively. Their actions were a little rough at first, but the more they walked, the smoother they became as they walked through the square. After they left, more and more people walked out of St. Ariana Cathedral. They consisted of the police, repair workers, gas company employees, restaurant chefs, white-haired old men, and simply dressed farmers. In the next hour, people constantly came out of the Evernight Cathedral. They either turned to different streets and went to different places, entering different houses, stopping at the square, or enjoying the pigeonless scenery. During this process, the number of people that came out had exceeded the limits of the cathedral's capacity, but there seemed to be no end to the people, as though the interior was connected to another city. After another 15 minutes, the entrance of St. Ariana Cathedral finally fell silent. However, there were rats, cockroaches, moths, ants, flies, and mosquitoes creeping outwards. Finally, a colorful window at the top of the cathedral opened. White pigeons flew out and landed in the middle of the square. The people who had stayed there came to life completely. Some teased the pigeons, others looked for hawkers, while some played a 7-string guitar, and others smiled as they conversed with their friends. A man wearing a top hat and a trench coat and carrying a cane left the municipal square. He came to the other side of the town and stopped in front of a wooden board. He took out his tools and wrote the name of the town on the wooden board, Yarnum. After some thought, the man wiped away Yarnum and wrote another name, Utopia. Backlund, inside the Hall family's luxurious villa. Alfred has already boarded the cruise ship back to the northern continent. Audrey didn't hide her surprise. It was September 1352. In the past half a year, Audrey didn't spend too much effort to make her father give up the thought of returning to East Chester County for the first half of the year. This was because there was a pressing need to rebuild Backlund and Constance City. The kingdom's political scene also needed a new balance. Earl Hall had too many things to handle and wasn't in the mood for a vacation. Therefore, whenever Earl Hall was put in a difficult spot, she just needed to take the initiative to say that she was willing to remain in Backland and return to East Chester County in the next 6 months to have things develop as she wanted and receive praise for. As for the psychology alchemists, they didn't rush her either. Up to now, the Psychology Alchemists' Council meeting had been held 3 times. It was mainly to communicate their research results and the various information of the areas under their jurisdiction. Only Ma'am Greed had asked about the clues to the Mind Dragon twice. To be frank, if Mr. Fool hadn't reminded Audrey to take note of the rabbit, Wrath, and the easily forgettable president, she would definitely find the conference interesting. Mr. Rabbit had plenty of ideas, but she remained as vigilant as ever. Yes, the liner has already left the harbor. Earl Hall smiled and nodded. When Alfred arrives in Backland and completes the necessary social intercourse, we will return to East Chester County for fox hunting. Autumn was the best time to hunt foxes. Audrey tersely acknowledged. All right. As a major general in the army, Alfred didn't follow the naval fleet to Desi Bay. Instead, he led his adjutants and squires and boarded a steam-powered sailboat hybrid for Pritz Harbor. After traveling for nearly 2 days, they encountered a storm in the Berserk Sea. As the ship shook violently, the sailors on the observatory saw some light through their telescopes. It came from a lighthouse. Author's note: I wrote in detail 3 plans in the previous chapter because I felt that the 3rd plan was most impactful, but it's impossible for Klein to undertake it with his character, so I had to unfortunately give it up. I specially wrote it out for all of you to have a sense of what's the most bizarre and mysterious method. Chapter 1329. A night without any abnormalities. The liner passed through the storm and approached the lighthouse. A small-scale harbor entered the sights of the captain, sailors, and passengers through the gloomy rain. A short while later, a man in his 30s, who was wearing a blue uniform and holding onto a black umbrella and a glass lantern, appeared at the dock. He used rather uncommon actions to guide the liner to moor. As the man watched the gangway lower, he opened his mouth and shouted, "Hey matey, where d'ya come from?" After most of his voice was swallowed by the wind, his voice successfully reached the liner's interior and entered Alfred's ears. "Do you know what this place is?" Alfred looked carefully at his adjutant and squire. He wasn't wearing a general ceremonial attire. Wearing a black trench coat that was commonly seen in Backland, his dazzling blonde hair drooped down casually, and his blue eyes looked like a deep lake in a forest. The adjutant, who had neatly combed his hair to the back, first shook his head to indicate his uncertainty before he explained, "The storm from before made me lose my bearings." At this moment, the captain held an umbrella and came to the shipboard. He answered the man, "We left East Balam 2 days ago and unfortunately encountered a storm." "What harbor is this?" The man's eyes darted around for a moment. Without giving a direct answer, he shouted, "Wait a moment, will ya?" He then turned around, holding the umbrella and the lantern as he ran towards the buildings near the dock. This reaction was beyond the expectations of Alfred and the other passengers, but it wasn't strange for the experienced ship captain, first mate, and others. They had encountered many abnormalities at the ports along the Berserk Sea. This made them patiently wait for subsequent developments. 5 to 6 minutes later, the man led a lady over. The woman didn't have an umbrella and was wearing a hooded raincoat smeared with Donningsman tree sap. As the 2 of them approached the liner, under the watch of the armed sailors, they climbed up the gangway to the deck. At such a distance, most of the passengers finally saw what the 2 of them looked like. The man had brown hair and brown eyes. His skin was rough, and it was obvious that he was of a lower socioeconomic status and had suffered the elements. The woman was in her 20s, and her eyes were limpid green. She had long, flaxen hair. A few wet strands clung to her face, making her appear pure and charming. This was a rather pretty lady with a wild temperament. "Hi there, this is Utopia Harbor," the man impatiently introduced. "I'm Theodore, the interim port captain." As he spoke, he laughed, as though he was happy that he had invented such an amazing position. Of course, the ship captain knew what a so-called interim port captain meant. He didn't take it to heart about this sudden happiness of a small fry. He frowned slightly and said, Utopia Harbor? Why haven't I heard of it? Theodore looked at him and said, what ye said is quite common. If it weren't for that landlubber hurricane, ye might never come here. Without waiting for him to say anything else, the lady rushed forward and said, Utopia isn't on the safe sea route. Usually, only people who understand these waters and know of this place will come here for supplies. So the main clientele of this harbor are pirates? How could the ship captain not be able to tell what she meant? And in times like this, tacitly acknowledging things without exposing them provided protection to both sides. He tersely acknowledged and said, and you are? My name is Tracy. The lady smiled. I'm the owner of the Harbor Hotel, and also its receptionist and attendant. She surveyed the area and said, it's quite a heavy storm, and the ship will be bumpy. It's not a wise choice to stay in there to rest. The hotel will provide you with stable beds, warm water, clean food, warm blankets, and an environment that will remind you of home. It's only 10 pence a night. I'm referring to the price of a single room. Other than that, you guys can still drink at the nearby bar and enjoy our warm hospitality. Clearly, this lady was here to solicit for business. The captain was rather alert and didn't respond directly. He nodded and said, I can't decide on behalf of the passengers. They are free to choose for themselves. Of course, as captain, I will stay here with my crew. Tracy maintained her smile and said, I'll wait at the hotel for guests who are willing to disembark. She seemed to have received a certain amount of education. She wasn't as hot and spirited as the women at other ports who spewed vulgarities with every sentence. Tracy turned around and was about to return when Theodore approached her and said with a sullen expression, You have to thank me for telling you the news immediately. As he spoke, his right hand pressed against Tracy's butt before he pinched hard. Pa! Tracy swatted away his hand and chided, You're a jerk who should be fucked by a donkey. She took a few steps forward and left the liner by the gangway. Theodore shook his hands and cursed with a smile, Bitch. This scene suddenly moved many passengers on board. To them, the biggest flaw on the ship was that it was boring, and there was a bar at the harbor. This meant that they could meet cheap street girls who were unlike those from the northern or southern continent. There were local street girls with their unique local charm. If one was lucky or willing to spend a lot of money, one of them might even be able to sleep with that spirited beauty with an attitude. Instantly, many passengers packed their luggage and prepared to head to the harbor hotel. Upon seeing this, Alfred's adjutant asked, General, are we getting off the ship? Alfred shook his head slowly. We don't know anything about this place. We have to be careful. Staying on the ship is the best choice. The adjutant had no objections to this. He asked worriedly, What about those who have already alighted? That's their choice. Alfred looked out of the window expressionlessly. If an accident happens, we can only keep more people safe. If it's not serious, then we will be able to resolve it easily. With that said, he turned to look at his adjutant and squire. We'll take turns to keep watch tonight to prevent any accidents. Alfred, who had interacted with the Numinous Episcopate, the Rose School of Thought, and other organizations in the southern continent, had an instinctive sense of vigilance towards unfamiliar places. After he exchanged his opinion with the ship captain, Alfred got into bed, listening to the strong winds hitting the glass windows and the torrential rain pattering the deck. He was about to doze off. At this moment, he heard a tender and sad melody coming from the direction of the harbor. It seemed to come from a flute, intermittent like a human whimpering through the storm. Alfred was instantly immersed in the music. It was as though he had returned to Backland, which always appeared in his dreams. He returned to a state that was a mixture of his happy childhood days, the vexing times of his youth, and other emotions. He shook his head violently and shook off the feeling. He realized that it wasn't a psychological effect, but a normal person's reaction. Alfred rolled out of bed and walked to the window. Using his sheriff beyonder powers, he confirmed that the music he had heard had come from the cheap hotel. It's not from the guests on board the ship. Their goal is very clear. They wouldn't be in the mood to play such a melody. There are tourists in Utopia to begin with, or could it be that owner and part-time attendant named Tracy? If it were her, she would be a lady with a story. Alfred sighed and retracted his gaze. He stopped pondering over the matter. Although he was curious, he had no intention of getting off the ship. Soon, the sound of the flute stopped. The harbor hotel regained its silence and nothing unexpected happened. Just like that, time passed, and as the storm stopped, the sky gradually brightened. At 8 in the morning, the liner passengers returned one after another. Every one of them had weak steps and looked haggard. Upon seeing this, the sailors immediately laughed and said, "The chicks here seem pretty good." The passengers shook their heads at the same time and looked regretful. One of them rubbed his temples and said, "The lanty-proof here isn't bad. It's cheaper than other places. I wasn't careful and had a little too much to drink and ended up falling asleep. I don't even know if anything happened with that babe. Sigh, I woke up to realize that the ship was about to leave, and I don't even remember what I did after getting drunk. Praise the lady. She let me lie in bed and not sleep in the rain." The other passengers chimed in to express their similar experiences. Of course, everyone had different details. For example, some passengers praised the breakfast dessert in the cheap hotel. The sailors were regretful that they didn't manage to drink the cheap and good lanty-proof. They started teasing the passengers. "Perhaps the one who spent the night with you wasn't the chicks here but the burly man like Theodore. Since all of you were drunk, there's no way to know what happened. Huh, try touching your assholes." Amidst the lively atmosphere, the sailors withdrew the gangway and raised the sails, allowing the liner to set off slowly. Alfred finally relaxed after they passed through a dark sea and returned to the familiar safe sea route. He smiled at his adjutant and squire and said, "You can mark this place on our map," mentioning that the liquor and desserts here aren't too bad. Yes, the girls have their own traits. After a few more days of traveling, the passenger finally arrived at Desi Bay's Eskelson Harbor, after traveling along a winding safe sea route. Alfred, who had the demeanor of a noble, and his socialite instincts, paid a visit to the brass of a nearby military base and shared a good dinner with them. When he returned to one of his father's vacation villas, he was surprised to find the squire whom he had sent away to gather for information. "What's wrong?" Alfred put away his disorganized thoughts. The squire lowered his voice and said, "General, all the official maps in the kingdom have no indication of Utopia Harbor." Chapter 13:30. Moving in. Alfred felt the room temperature plummet when he heard his squire. An indescribable chill invaded his body, freezing his blood and bone marrow. When the liner stopped at Utopia port, he had expected the worst situation to happen. Utopia was the headquarters of some cult, and that everyone there was a dangerous lunatic. But now, the truth was even worse. Perhaps Utopia never existed. At that moment, Alfred was unusually thankful that he was no longer the noble scion he was when he left Backland. He had accumulated a great deal of experience and had thus, not really entered Utopia Harbor. Under the gaze of the adjutant and squire, the major general paced back and forth with a solemn expression. He calmly instructed, "Draft up a telegram and report to MI9 about what happened in Utopia. At the same time, request the local official beyonders to immediately take action and contact the captain to list down all the people who entered Utopia Harbor. If necessary, pay each of them a visit and confirm if there are any problems." "Yes, sir." His adjutant immediately stood at attention and saluted. After the adjutant walked out of the study, Alfred said to a squire, "Bring up the typewriter from downstairs. I want to write a detailed report." His plan was to first use a telegram to report the key information to the brass and not delay the initial actions necessary. Then, he would reveal more details with a confidential document and provide more information for the military brass to make a decision. Wendell walked into a second-class carriage with one hand on his top hat and the other carrying a suitcase. He wasn't even 30 years old. His sideburns were deep black and his brown eyes were calm. He didn't have any unique features that anyone could remember, but he exuded comfortable vibes. A few months ago, he was still a Phanepotter intelligence officer who was active in Desi Bay, and had contributed greatly. Now that he was a Sequence 7 Beyonder, he was part of MI9's Internal Affairs Department. Today, his goal was to send a confidential document to Backlund and personally hand it into the hands of MI9's director. After sitting down, Wendell bought a newspaper from the paperboy and leisurely read through it. This was just a superficial act. In reality, he began to use his Beyonder powers to illustrate portraits of the passengers around him, remembering all their characteristics, making meticulous and perfect preparations for any accidents that might happen later. Chew. The steam locomotive was chugging forward as the scenery outside sped past the windows. A few hours later, Wendell cast his gaze out of the window with some anxiety. The sky was already filled with dark clouds, and a storm was about to descend. This meant that the steam locomotive would stop at a station ahead of time to tide through the storm. It might only continue its journey the next morning, and not reach its designated location. In Wendell's opinion, this would undoubtedly lead to more risks due to a deviation in his expectations. However, it was beyond him. He couldn't change the weather like the sea god, who was promoted by the Rørsted Archipelago's new government. The only thing he could do was pray to the Lord of Storms. Reality proved that praying was useless most of the time. By the time the sky turned dark, the station in front of them had already sent a light signal to get the train to slow down and stop. Chew. The steam engine whistled again, and the train slowed down. Finally, it stopped at an unfamiliar platform. In the next second, near the steam-powered train's head, the mechanical door opened. The train conductor stood at the entrance and shouted to the staff on the platform, "What happened up ahead?" "Heavy rain. Visibility is 0, the white-side-burned employee answered loudly. Just as he finished speaking, a muffled thunder sounded, causing everyone to tremble as they sensed the incoming storm. "Damn it," the train conductor cursed. "Which station is this?" As it wasn't a normal stop, he didn't really know which station he was at. After all, the schedule he was in charge of didn't stop at every station in the past. "Utopia. It's a small station. You can arrange the rest yourself," the staff shouted and ran towards the other end of the platform with the glass lantern in hand. "I have to give the train behind a signal." The train conductor had no doubts about the staff's attitude because this was a normal dispatch process. Otherwise, an accident between two steam locomotives would happen. He could even be certain that the other staff members of the Utopia station had already sent a telegram to the other stations to warn them. Of course, they must have received a telegram to learn of the area ahead being enveloped by a heavy storm. Utopia, Wendell repeated the name in a low voice, not finding any useful information in his mind. Of course, he didn't think too much of it. This was because there were many unknown steam locomotive stations in the entire Lone Kingdom. This was a manifestation of the country's overall strength. The train conductor looked at the dark sky and muttered a few words before using the newest megaphone to speak to the passengers on board. "A storm is coming. The train will stop at Utopia Station until 8 in the morning tomorrow." He estimated the storm to continue the entire night. "You can stay in the carriage, or you can exit on your own accord to head into the city to look for an inn. Tomorrow, simply show your ticket stub to board the carriage again. Remember to be on time." The train conductor gave the passengers two choices. Wendell looked at the passengers inside the second-class carriage and pondered for a few seconds before carrying his suitcase and walking out of the train. It wasn't that he couldn't handle the harsh environment that wasn't conducive for good sleep. When he was an intelligence officer, he had been through plenty of hardship. He was only relying on his professionalism that the sealed carriages, which were limited in space for passenger movement, weren't as safe as a single room in an inn. Of course, he could also stay up all night, but this would definitely affect his condition tomorrow. Clearly, he still had a long journey tomorrow. After exiting Utopia Station, Wendell got on a rental carriage by the side of the road and said to the carriage driver, "To the municipal square." In the Lone Kingdom, there would definitely be a cathedral and a hotel near the municipal square. "Sir, are you planning on going to the hotel?" the carriage driver asked as he made the horse turn around, seemingly capable of getting along well with anyone. Yes. As a Sequence 7 Beyonder, Wendell didn't hide it. In his opinion, as long as he lived in the city center while overseas, he could easily find a group of helpers with his status, and his strength was enough to support him in completing this task. The best hotel in Utopia is Red Boots. Are we going there? The coach driver asked in a suggestive tone that all men knew. If he didn't have a mission, Wendell wouldn't mind pleasuring himself. However, he could only shake his head without any hesitation. I want a quiet hotel. All right, the coachman replied disappointedly. Let's go to the Iris's hotel. No one will disturb you there. As the carriage advanced, Wendell cast his gaze outside the window to observe the situation outside. Perhaps it was because the storm was about to arrive, the people on the road were all in a rush. Even the paperboys looked down. A very small city. Wendell came to a preliminary conclusion from the lack of a track carriage. He only saw one trackless carriage. This meant that most of the areas in Utopia could be reached on foot in an adequate amount of time. Just as he had expected, in less than 10 minutes, the rental carriage stopped at the entrance of the Iris's hotel. Wendell paid the fare and rushed into the hotel before the rain fell. He heard pattering sounds behind him just as he entered. After checking in and putting down his luggage, Wendell rested for a while. He kept the confidential document close to him and went to the restaurant on the first floor to enjoy dinner. He cautiously didn't have any alcoholic beverages and asked for a cup of fizzling iced tea, which was supposedly a local specialty, and a fried pork chop drenched in apple juice. As a former intelligence officer of high society, Wendell didn't have much expectations for dinner this time, but he was surprised by the meal. The pork chop was fried in a succulent and juicy manner that gave off a strong fragrance. The apple juice that was poured on it had a slightly acerbic texture that washed away most of the cloyed taste. The fizzling iced tea was refreshing and especially delicious. When he foot the bowl, Wendell nodded at the medium-billed waiter and said, "Please send my compliments to the chef for giving me the pleasure of this wonderful dinner." The ordinary-looking waiter smiled and replied, "That wouldn't be an issue. In all of Utopia City, our chefs are the best." Wendell didn't chit-chat and quickly returned to his room to make some arrangements to prevent others from sneaking in. Then, he fell asleep without any hesitation. He used a relatively safe period of time, which any possible enemies would find unsuitable for taking action, to sleep and pass the time late into the night. After an unknown period of time, Wendell was suddenly woken up by an intense argument. He snapped open his pocket watch to take a look and realized that it wasn't even midnight. "It's from next door." A woman's voice. A man's voice. Wendell sat up and listened carefully. Initially, he suspected that it was a man and woman flirting, but later, he realized that it was too intense. Some of the items were even thrown onto the wall. A quarrel turning into a fight? Just as Wendell mumbled, he heard the shouting, cursing, and screaming of a woman. Beating a woman? As a lone gentleman, although Wendell believed in the Lord of Storms and discriminated against women, it didn't stop him from thinking that men shouldn't be violent towards women. After 2 seconds of consideration, he decided to knock on the door and remind his neighbors to take note. At that moment, a tragic cry rang out. This was obviously from a man. Thud. Something heavy fell to the floor. Wendell's brows twitched as he sharply caught the scent of a criminal case. He stood up, put on his coat, and went to the room next door. He bent his fingers and knocked twice. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and a beautiful woman with long, wavy hair appeared in front of Wendell. Her hair was in a mess, and her face was ghastly pale. Her light green clothes were stained with blood, and she was holding a dagger that was dripping with blood. The lady in her early 20s stammered for a while before speaking in a dreamy tone, "I killed someone." Chapter 1331 Pleasure in helping others. Wendell wasn't unfamiliar with murder at all. When he heard that, he wasn't afraid at all. Instead, he calmly allowed his gaze to wander past the woman at the door and into the room's interior. He immediately saw a man lying on the ground. His chest was blood red. Are you sure he's dead? Wendell asked calmly. The young lady in her 20s was at a loss at first. Then, she answered with uncertainty, maybe. I don't know. If there's still hope, we need to send him to the hospital immediately. Wendell's tone was like he was speaking to a patient's family, not a murderer. The lady holding the blood dagger subconsciously turned her body and made way. Wendell took a few steps forward and approached the victim. He didn't need to squat down. He swept his gaze and made a judgment based on various signs. He is indeed dead. The woman in her 20s with messy, flaxen-colored hair didn't show any obvious change in expression. She looked down at her toes and said, "Call the police." "How do I address you?" Wendell had already heard hurried footsteps coming from the stairs. It was obvious that the attendant or hotel owner came up to check on the commotion after hearing the screams. Tracy, the pure lady with an attitude, answered softly. She then sank into her own world and didn't say another word. Wendell was just about to say something when the owner of the hotel who had helped him check in previously had already rushed through the door. "Goddess," the elderly man shouted after seeing the situation in the room. Wendell pressed down with his right hand, gesturing for him to calm down before saying, "Call the police immediately. I'll stay here and watch." His temperament and words exuded a sense of confidence that convinced others. The owner of the hotel didn't waste any time and immediately turned around and ran downstairs. As for Wendell, when he first came over to check on the situation, it was just a habit as a gentleman. In fact, he didn't have the intention to get involved in it. After all, he was still shouldering the mission. However, Miss Tracy's dazed, detached, and cold attitude induced a sense of pity in him. This was a normal reaction for a man. He surveyed the area as though he was conversing with the air. Killing someone doesn't imply a harsh punishment. It can be categorized into many kinds of situations. Tracy slowly raised her head and cast her gaze at the gentleman. There was an indescribable luster in her lifeless eyes. Wendell glanced at her bruised face. "He hit you?" "Yes." The man seemed to have some sort of authority, making Tracy, who wanted to remain silent, finally answer. Wendell looked down at the dagger that was no longer dripping blood. "Was it you who brought it here, or him?" Tracy's response was a little slow as she replied, "Him." Wendell nodded slightly and said, "Exercising your right to self-defense is in line with the law. I can testify to the police that you had an intense argument before it happened and that there was a fight. Clearly, men naturally possess an advantage in this aspect. I'm not discriminating against women, but it's something explained by science and experience." He paused and asked, "What is the relationship between the two of you? What happened?" Tracy's eyes darted about and she recovered a little from that deep, reclusive state. She seemed to be answering a policeman's question as she said with a look of hope and sorrow, I am his mistress." Upon saying this, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Tracy's face. "I used to be an ugly woman who blindly chased after money. Not long after I left the grammar school, I became his mistress under his enticement. He gave me a hotel and let me stay there. I wait for his arrival or for him to summon me every week. I lost interest in this lifestyle, feeling increasingly suppressed as my inferiority complex grew. I wanted to return everything to him and get rid of him completely, but he wasn't agreeable. He threatened me using all sorts of methods and refused to let me leave him. The recent times we met all ended in fights. Just now, he said that there was only one way to leave him, and that was death. Then, he beat me up and took out a dagger. Why, you know what happened after that, mistress." Wendell cast a regretful and pitiful glance at Tracy's face and said, "The traces at the scene have also confirmed the development of the situation." He had originally thought that Tracy and the deceased were husband and wife, but to his surprise, their relationship was worse than he had imagined. Tracy nodded blankly and said, "Thank you." She didn't say another word. She only broke the silence when the police arrived. She raised her hands and accepted the handcuffs. Wendell looked at her staggered pace and said to the police, bring her to check on her injuries first and treat them to avoid any accidents. The police officers didn't know why they had to listen to instructions from a witness. In short, they led Tracy and Wendell to a small hospital in the city without any objections under the heavy rain. As Tracy was a woman, Wendell and 2 police officers waited in the corridor of the hospital without entering the room. As time passed, Wendell saw a pregnant woman being sent to the delivery room in a hurry. There seemed to be some problems and they needed help with the labor process. After a while, he heard the sound of a baby crying, an announcement of a new life coming to this world. At this moment, Tracy happened to come out. "Do you feel it?" "Life's beauty," Wendell said to Tracy solemnly. As Tracy listened to the baby's cries amidst the howling wind and rain, her expression was clearly touched. Her face had already been wiped clean, making her look very clean and simple. After a few seconds, Tracy returned to her senses and nodded at Wendell before saying, "Thank you." This time, she was no longer as numb, blank, and reclusive. Wendell secretly heaved a sigh of relief and followed her to the police station to record a statement. After doing what was necessary, Wendell walked to the street side and prepared to take a rental carriage back to the Irises Hotel. However, in the middle of the stormy night, there were no pedestrians or carriages on the road. This is the disadvantage of a small city. "It's not convenient enough," Wendell muttered. He opened the umbrella he had brought with him and made his way back to the Irises Hotel. As a former sheriff, he had the memory, in the mystical sense, of the route he had taken before. He wasn't worried about getting lost in the small city. At this moment, the storm had already reduced significantly. However, the strong winds continued to sweep past Wendell, causing rain to fall on him. This caused Wendell to raise his right hand and block his chest. That confidential document was hidden on the inside of the clothing. Wendell had previously kept the document close to him even when he was sleeping, not allowing it to be separated from him. For this reason, he had already developed a habit. As long as he had the corresponding self-reminders, he wouldn't turn over once he fell asleep. After walking for about 15 minutes in the small town of Utopia, Wendell saw the Irises Hotel. At that moment, his top hat and clothes were drenched due to the strong winds. This made him a little worried that the confidential document would be damaged by the water. "Strictly speaking, I have already violated the rules of the mission, but how could I not help a lady like her? This is what a gentleman should do." Wendell was slightly vexed, but he didn't regret it at all. After entering the room, he immediately removed his jacket and took out the document, placing it on the table. The envelope containing the document was already visibly soaked. There were quite a few places that seemed to tear with a little force. Wendell immediately rang the bell and called for an attendant to ask for a gas stove, hoping to raise the temperature in the room and accelerate the air-drying process of the sealed document. In the process of waiting, he realized that the silence expected from the middle of the night wasn't there. It was as if the screams and the police's arrival had caused the tenants and nearby residents to wake up without being able to fall asleep. The howling winds lessened significantly, and Wendell could hear children crying, married couples arguing, the sound of a wooden violin being played, intermittent sobbing, the footsteps on the stairs, and the occasional sounds of discussion that were sometimes suppressed and sometimes raised without realizing it. He didn't feel anything about this lively scene. He just felt that they were noisy that prevented him from calming down. After a while, the attendant brought over a coal stove. Wendell relaxed and asked casually, "Do you know that Miss Tracy?" The thin attendant shook his head. "No." He then added, "I heard that she's a local, but I've been living outside in the plantations outside the city before this year." "What do you know about her?" Wendell asked subconsciously. "She comes to our hotel 3 to 5 times a month, with the dead man." The waiter suddenly sighed. "She's not happy at all." Wendell was silent for a few seconds before dismissing the attendant and returning to his desk. Seconds ticked by as the envelope outside the confidential document gradually dried up. At this moment, the inside and outside of the hotel had become relatively quiet. Only the sound of rain falling and the sound of the windows being rattled by the winds could be heard. Wendell was full of spirit as he recalled everything that had happened. He sighed for Miss Tracy's life and flipped the envelope. At this moment, he realized that some damage had appeared on the bottom part of the envelope, revealing the piece of paper inside. Wendell frowned, knowing that he was about to be punished. Of course, the punishment wouldn't be too heavy, as if the document to be distributed was confidential enough, he wouldn't be the only one to dispatch it. Wendell had originally planned on maintaining the present state and showing the damaged situation during the handover. However, when he swept his gaze, he saw a word on the document through the hole: Utopia. Wendell's nerves tightened, and he felt as if the sound of the wind and rain outside had suddenly stopped. Chapter 1332. Shocked in the middle of the night. Why is the confidential document that I'm dispatching mentioning Utopia? What's so special about this place? Many thoughts flashed through Wendell's mind as he heard a buzzing sound. At this moment, he felt as though he was going to fall sick from overexertion. Wendell quickly forced himself to calm down. He carefully recalled all the experiences he had encountered after coming to Utopia, and he discovered that there were no problems with every detail. They were all things that he might encounter in daily life. The only thing that made him uneasy was that his arrival was too coincidental. It was common for the steam locomotive to stop at the last minute due to a storm, but to stop somewhere related to the confidential document in his hand couldn't be explained away with coincidence. Wendell stared at the confidential document on the table with a solemn expression. He hesitated as to whether he should open them and read them carefully. Perhaps it's just a passing mention of Utopia. My actions will severely violate internal affairs. Perhaps this is the report of a certain intelligence agent secretly investigating Utopia. The contents will decide whether I survive to a certain extent, or die. After struggling for a while, Wendell looked out the window at the dark night sky and reached for the document. Only by being alive could one consider the punishment. Having made up his mind, Wendell swiftly removed the envelope outside and flipped through the typed files inside. As he read, his hand trembled slightly. He felt a chill run down his back. Even the burning furnace didn't help. No matter which angle he read it from, the confidential report in his hands indicated that there was something wrong with Utopia, the entire town. This might be a city that didn't exist in the real world. Wendell felt his mouth go dry, as though he had heard the footsteps of death slowly approaching him with a sickle. Instinctively, he wanted to get up, but in the end, he controlled himself and didn't react rashly. This was because he could feel pairs of eyes staring at him in the darkness outside, the room upstairs, and the corridor outside. What should I do? Up till now, nothing abnormal happened. This means that if I didn't know anything, it's possible that I'd be safe and welcome daybreak. I've read through a lot of information, and if I rashly show that I already know about the strange environment around me, it would only cause danger to erupt ahead of time. However, I can't just not do anything and leave my fate to luck. Wendell recalled all the dangers he had experienced before and quickly made up his mind. He was prepared to immediately return to the steam locomotive, and stay far away from Utopia to a certain extent. At least, most of the people there were normal, while the city was full of danger. Of course, Wendell couldn't just run back like that. He had to act normal, as though he had left the hotel in the middle of the night to return to the steam locomotive station. Amidst his thoughts, Wendell put away his confidential report and stood up calmly. He put on his coat and put on his top hat. Then, with his luggage in one hand and an umbrella in the other, he calmly walked to the door and turned the doorknob. At this moment, the corridor was dark, with only a few gas lamps on both sides of the corridor giving off light that wasn't bright enough. It added signs of human life to the silent environment in which he could hear a pin drop. When Wendell entered the corridor, the wooden floor beneath his feet made a slight creaking sound. It was so clear in the silent night that it traveled far into the distance. With a slight frown, Wendell intentionally took a normal step forward and approached the staircase in the middle of the corridor. He walked without any worries and had no intention of acting furtively. As he saw the stairs getting closer, he suddenly heard a squeaking sound behind him. "Sir, where are you going?" A slightly hoarse and intermittent male voice sounded in Wendell's ears. Wendell's body stiffened. He slowly turned back and saw the wooden door to the service room open. An attendant came out and stood in the shadows of the door. He quickly smiled and said calmly, "I have an important item on the steam locomotive. I'm afraid that someone would take it away, so I have no choice but to return now." At this point, he softly grumbled, "A murder happened at the hotel. I don't want to stay here anymore. I can't sleep at all. I'm very sorry." The attendant bowed slightly and responded, "I won't spread the news." Wendell nodded with a promise and then walked back up the stairs. Perhaps it was due to the dim lighting in the night, he walked very carefully. Every step was like walking on the edge of a precipice. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Wendell, who had been on guard towards the attendant behind him, finally returned to the first floor. At that moment, not a single person was present in the hotel lobby. All the items were hidden in the darkness, and the faint light from the outside cast a blurry silhouette, just like monsters eager to devour people. Wendell looked ahead and walked through the dark lobby before reaching the door. Just as he pushed open the door and went out, he suddenly heard some rustling sounds behind him. It was as if there were rats moving around, or it was as if someone was approaching him with light footsteps. The back of Wendell's head went numb, but he held back his impulse to make a dash for it. He raised his head normally and looked up at the sky, which had already stopped raining. Then, he inhaled the cold, fresh air and made his way to the steam locomotive station. He quickened his pace, looking like he was afraid of the night and eager to end this journey. As he walked, Wendell saw a signboard from the corner of his eye. Utopia Telegraph Office. The telegraph office. Perhaps I can try sneaking in and send an emergency telegram to the Backlund headquarters and Eskelson military base. That way, I can look forward to the rescue from demigods. If I'm really trapped here and unable to leave, this will be the only way to save myself. Wendell thought for a moment before taking a few steps diagonally, arriving at the entrance of the Utopia Telegraph Office. He wasn't in a hurry to find a place to sneak in. Instead, he focused his attention and listened to the movements inside. Following that, he heard intermittent sounds of heavy breathing. This made Wendell occasionally feel that there was no one inside, and at times, he felt that there was more than one person inside. Suddenly, the sound of breathing stopped. All of Wendell's hair stood on end. His intuition told him that a figure was standing quietly behind the door of the telegraph office. Without any hesitation, Wendell immediately gave up the thought of sending a telegram. He walked past the door and continued proceeding forward. For the rest of the journey, even a gust of wind left Wendell trembling in fear. He was afraid of encountering an unknown danger. Time passed slowly as Wendell experienced the torment. Finally, he reached the entrance of the steam locomotive station and saw that the door was tightly shut. He couldn't enter. This wasn't a problem for Wendell. He first passed the umbrella to his left hand that was carrying his luggage, then went to the side and found a wall. With a press of his palm, he rose into the air and easily flipped over. After landing his feet firmly on the ground, Wendell heaved a sigh of relief and began walking towards the platform at an unhurried pace. At that moment, an inaudible sound of footsteps could be heard behind him. "What are you doing here?" A deep and hoarse voice rang out. Wendell's toes tightened as cold sweat broke out on his back. He didn't hesitate. As he prepared to get violent, he made his body turn slowly and stiffly. The first thing that entered his eyes was a classic glass lantern, followed by the staff member from before. Wendell exhaled and grumbled, "It's not appropriate for you to appear in such an environment on such a night. As a gentleman, you have to avoid scaring others." "I'm not a gentleman," the staff member replied in an unfriendly manner. Wendell pointed to the corner of the platform. "I'm going to the bathroom." He had already observed the platform's environment and layout of the platform earlier in the day. "Then, why are you here?" the worker asked. "I'm lost," Wendell answered simply. Following that, he ignored the staff and walked towards the bathroom. Behind him, the staff member watched silently without saying a word. This gave Wendell a lot of mental stress, but he maintained his gait very well. In the bathroom, under the illumination of the wall lamps, Wendell took nearly a minute to relieve the tension in his body and successfully peed. After returning to the steam locomotive, Wendell finally found a sense of security as he looked at the passengers lying on their beds. In the next few hours, he didn't sleep at all and was on guard against any accidents. Just as Wendell's grasp of the passage of time slowed down, the sky gradually brightened and dispersed the darkness. In the next 2 hours, the travelers who had gone to Utopia returned one after another. Some bought a bottle of local red wine. Some looked haggard. They looked like they had been beaten up or were hungover. Wendell was very wary of them, but he couldn't discover anything unusual in the details. Chew. Finally, the whistle sounded as the steam locomotive slowly began to move. Amidst the chugging sounds, the train left Utopia Station. After that, they went through another dark, gloomy weather. Fortunately, no thunderstorm descended, and the sun quickly pierced through the clouds and illuminated the ground. For Wendell, all of this was normal. It had been like this since he arrived at Utopia last night. If not for the confidential report which was hidden near his chest, he definitely wouldn't have believed that there was any problem with Utopia. When the steam locomotive reached the next stop, one that everyone was familiar with, Wendell finally relaxed. He felt as if his brain ached with a throb, as though he had been drained of his energy. At this moment, he quickly recalled his experience in Utopia. As he recalled, Wendell suddenly sat up straight. He had used the excuse of going to the bathroom last night, but he was carrying his luggage and an umbrella. He didn't look like a passenger who had just come down from a steam train. The station worker didn't realize this, or rather, he had already discovered it, but he did not expose him for some unknown reason. Chapter 1333 Warning. Using his experience as example, all of a sudden, the muscles on Wendell's back began to tense up as if he were about to explode. He was shocked and doubtful as several guesses flashed through his mind. The residents of Utopia are monsters in human skin. They usually look normal, but once they encounter blind spots in logic, they would show a side that is different from an ordinary person, ignoring the points that are obviously problematic. Or perhaps that staff realized that I was lying and was unwilling to deal with me, so he pretended not to see me and let me go? But why? Yes, carrying my luggage to the bathroom can be explained away as me being afraid of losing my luggage, but the entire platform is sheltered. There's no need to take the umbrella. Besides, the rain had already stopped. Wendell instinctively turned his gaze out of the window, only to see the sunlight shining on the platform he was at. One by one, passengers waited in order behind the safety line, completely different from the dark and gloomy vibes that Utopia gave off. Phew. He exhaled and suddenly relaxed. This isn't Utopia. I've already left. Wendell murmured to himself as he wiped away the cold sweat that had seeped out from his forehead. When he recalled his oversight earlier, it was as if he had fallen into a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from no matter how hard he tried. After a while, Wendell stood up and decided to smoke at the platform to ease his mood. The tobacco comforted him greatly, allowing him to recall his past experiences in Utopia. During this process, he gained inspiration from his encounter. Maybe it's because I sincerely helped Tracy, so that staff member intentionally ignored my problematic actions and let me go? Compared to the entire population of Utopia being monsters hiding underneath human skin, Wendell was more willing to accept this explanation. At this moment, from the corner of his eye, he saw the conductor talking to a group of people in a corner. Wendell took a few steps forward, trying to hear what they were saying. With the help of his hearing that transcended the normal limits of hearing, he vaguely heard the conversation from a distance that wouldn't incur suspicion. Last night, the station. Utopia doesn't exist in the kingdom. Please keep it a secret. Wendell's brows twitched slightly. Based on the description of the document near his chest, he roughly understood what the train conductor was talking about. They were saying that the kingdom didn't have a station known as Utopia at all, and last night, the steam locomotive had gone missing. At that moment, a strong sense of horror surged through Wendell's heart again. He felt that it was his greatest blessing to be able to leave Utopia alive. Alfred spent nearly a week before returning to Backlund from Eskilstuna harbor. This was because he had visited the family of his deceased comrades, his old friends, the elders who had returned to their fief for vacation, and some of his family's business partners along the way. This is even more tiring than participating in battle, Alfred grumbled to his father, Earl Hall. Earl Hall smiled and pointed at the staircase. Return to your room and get some rest. We'll talk in the study later. He was quite satisfied with the mental state and progress of his second son. Alfred surveyed the area and asked with a smile, "Where's the most dazzling jewel of Backlund?" He paused for a moment before adding, "What about Hibbert?" Earl Hall laughed and said, "Audrey went to her foundation and will only return in the afternoon. She kept complaining that you couldn't provide her with a definite schedule, preventing her from knowing when you would arrive. Hibbert is now a cabinet secretary. He's very busy." Alfred nodded and returned to his room to take a shower. He changed into a shirt, vest, and formal suit. "I prefer East Balham's casualness." He looked into the mirror and smiled at his adjutant. "This outfit makes you look more like a noble," his adjutant said as he handed him the document in his hand. "General, this is from MI9. Me 9? Alfred thoughtfully destroyed the seal on the envelope. "There's a result regarding the investigation of Utopia that quickly?" Before he could finish his sentence, he pulled out the document and flipped through it. During this process, Alfredo flipped through the pages slower and slower. In the end, he read it again from the first page. The main content of this investigation was divided into two parts. The first was regarding the MI9 member who had dispatched Alfred's report. He had accidentally entered Utopia and witnessed a murder case. He managed to forcefully escape in the middle of the night and return to the steam locomotive. The second was that the railways in Desi Bay which led to Backlund didn't have a stop named Utopia Station along the way, nor was there a harbor known as Utopia in the Berserk Sea. The subsequent investigators didn't find any traces. The two cases didn't exceed the limits of Alfred's imagination. What surprised him was the criminal involved in the murder. Her name was Tracy. She was the owner of a hotel. She had received middle-class education and graduated from grammar school. After that, she became a mistress of a businessman. Recently, she was trying to free herself from this identity. This was identical to the owner of the Harbor Hotel, Tracy, that Alfred had met. Every detail matched. As a result, Alfred determined that the culprit behind the murder was Tracy, the beautiful woman who had received a certain degree of education, who was able to produce sad music in the middle of the night. Is this her backstory? Alfred muttered to himself silently. This made the residents of Utopia seem very realistic. It wasn't what Alfred had expected, an illusion. In other words, after the outsiders left, the inhabitants of Utopia continued to lead their own lives. They had their own love, hatred, pains, and sorrow. They had all sorts of experiences. Apart from Utopia seeming to not exist in the real world, it was similar to any ordinary town in the Lone Kingdom. Perhaps, Utopia is real. Everyone there is real. However, if one wants to enter the town, they have to be in the right place at the right time. Alfred nodded indiscernibly and put away the investigation report he had received from MI9. To him, even if this matter ended here, he had no intention to investigate further. One had to know that, in the southern continent, there were countless bizarre incidents and phenomena. If one was too curious, it would only bring him greater danger than he imagined. After adjusting his clothes and mood, Alfred came to his father's study and knocked on the door with his curled finger. "Come on in." Earl Hall's voice rang out. Alfred tidied his blonde hair, pushed the door open, and sat down. Earl Hall smiled at him and said, "You're already a man." "No one would say such words to a man," Alfred replied without any reservations. "In my heart, you're still that rebellious youth," Earl Hall said with a smile. "You're already a Sequence 5 Beyonder?" Alfred replied with a double entendre, "Yes, I am a real knight." Earl Hall nodded and suddenly sighed. "You should have experienced a lot of hardship. From what I know, no matter if it's the potions or war, they will bring serious damage to people, from their bodies to their minds. Everyone undergoes a lot of pain in their lives, Alfred said with a sigh. He used a loan-styled euphemism. After a pause, he added, compared to when I left Backlund, my present state is even better. As long as I grasp a method properly, I don't need to worry too much about the impact of the madness at my level. Earl Hall didn't continue on this matter and instead said, your sister has also become a Beyonder. Oh. Alfred was shocked at first, but then he remembered something. He said with some annoyance, I thought she just changed her hobby. From the looks of it, Audrey's adventure had a little bit of your help, Earl Hall said, seemingly enlightened. I hope you can talk to her about how dangerous, crazy, and painful it is about the sequence potions. Let her remain at her current level. Alfred replied without hesitation, I'll do it. In the evening, in Audrey's small study room. Alfred, why are you looking for me? Audrey, who had changed into home clothes, led Susie and opened the door for her brother. She had been waiting for her brother for a few minutes. I have something to warn you of. Alfred walked into the study and casually pulled a chair over. Audrey smiled and pointed at the golden retriever. Do you need Susie to leave? Alfred couldn't help but smile as he looked at the obedient golden retriever who was sitting by the side, her eyes filled with a look of sentience. There's no need for that. I believe it won't eavesdrop on our conversation. Audrey casually corrected him. After the noble girl sat opposite him, Alfred sighed inwardly. After not seeing her for a few years, her younger sister was no longer as tender as before. Regardless of her looks or temperament, she had already reached a level that brought about amazement. She was no longer the little girl from the past. Alfred retracted his gaze and asked casually, I heard that you became a Beyonder? Yes. Audrey nodded frankly. Alfred had originally planned on asking what sequence she was, but after some thought, he felt that it was too direct. It was easy for her to flare up, so he deliberated over his words and said, you should be a Beyonder of the spectator pathway, right? The rainbow salamander has similar powers. The rainbow salamander was a gift from Alfred to his sister. After Audrey gave an affirmative answer, Alfred joked, can you do treatment in the mind domain now? Most Beyonders, including me, need help in this aspect. Yes, I forgot to tell you that I'm already a Sequence 5 disciplinary paladin of the Arbiter pathway. Audrey pursed her lips and smiled. I'm a qualified psychiatrist who has undergone professional training. You can verify this with father and mother. She's already a Sequence 7. Alfred's expression gradually turned solemn. Audrey, I have to remind you that the potions do not only bring about strength. Having said that, he paused and observed his sister's reaction. He realized that Audrey wasn't impatient at all and was listening very seriously. Every potion contains madness that can lead to a loss of control. I've seen similar situations before. More than once. They happen to my enemies, and they happen to my friends. No one is spared. Alfred amalgamated his experiences in East Balam and began explaining the dangers of the potion in detail. During this process, he realized that his sister, Audrey, wasn't the only one listening attentively. Furthermore, Susie, the golden retriever, appeared extremely quiet. Chapter 1334 Night with the Moon MI9's office building was located on Bellotto Street in Westborough, and it was an inconspicuous three-story building. The entrance didn't show any signs of its identity. It simply hung a door sign, 9. The core of this office building was underground, and above it was for the clerks. Of course, most of the Beyonders who were under MI9 wouldn't go underground for no reason. The environment there wasn't good, and the atmosphere was oppressive. It was possible that an accident could happen due to the failure to watch over a sealed artifact. Zio was now the deputy team leader of the National Security and Counter-Espionage Team. She was in charge of a rather small-scale Beyonder team, responsible for handling espionage cases regarding Intis in the greater area of Backlund. There's a mission here. Her superior, MI9's deputy director, the team leader of the National Security and Counter-Espionage Team, Lieutenant General Pantek, picked up a document and handed it across the desk opposite him. Is it very urgent? Zio received it and asked cautiously. Lieutenant General Pantek was a typical lone old man with a case of severe hairline recession. He picked up a white porcelain coffee cup and took a sip. Not at all. It's quite low risk. In fact, this mission will be sent to all members, hoping that someone will be able to complete it by luck. This description was out of Zio's expectations, but she didn't open the dossier on the spot and directly replied, I will inform my team members. Zio returned to her own room after leaving Lieutenant General Pantek's office. When she threw herself into her seat, she seemed to have hidden herself. Zio quickly browsed through the documents in her hand and roughly understood why the deputy director said that. The utopia that needed investigation didn't seem to be anywhere in the northern and southern continent, nor were there on any of the known islands in the 5 seas. In the past 2 weeks, many people had entered the so-called utopia, but the way they entered was completely different. Some entered from the Berserk Sea's Sonia sea waters, arriving by a terrifying storm. Some were midway on a railway that led from Desi Bay to Backlund. Due to a heavy storm, they had been delayed and stopped at the city. Others were in Civilaus County, and they entered because they were lost. Up to now, no one has been affected by the damage or mentally influenced. It's no wonder Deputy Director Pantek said that the danger level is very low. Also, there's no way to conclude the rules regarding the case, making it difficult for one to find the true location of Utopia. Therefore, there's no way for them to send people in to investigate. Yes. I can only tell all members of the situation, and hope that one of them will chance upon Utopia and carefully gather information in secret when they are there. Zio put down the documents in her hand and stood up regretfully, preparing to inform the Beyonders under her. She was regretful that the mission was so difficult that she almost couldn't see hope. This made her unable to accumulate more merit points. In the past half year, Zio had been very busy every day in order to deal with the pending apocalypse. As she dealt with MI9's matters, she completed all the missions Mr. Fool had given her, so as to accumulate contributions on both sides in exchange for the formula and Beyonder characteristics of the imperative mage formula and Beyonder characteristic, to fulfill the wish of becoming a demigod. And up till now, Zio was still lacking a little on both fronts, especially in MI9. If she didn't make any significant contribution, Zio couldn't see any hope. If not for the generous salary from MI9 and all kinds of benefits that came with it, and how she could rely on her status and identity to monopolize a large amount of information so as to help her complete the missions given by Mr. Fool, Zio yearned to resign and become a bounty hunter again. That way, she would have more freedom. I can ask about this case at the next tarot gathering. Perhaps Mr. World will have some clues. As Zio thought, she pushed open the door to the room where her team members were. After assigning the Utopia mission, Zio specially instructed, if the situation isn't right, even if you have the chance to enter Utopia, you can give up immediately. The town of unknown authenticity hasn't shown any danger. Perhaps it's because it hadn't been triggered. After busying herself for a while more, Zio finally ended her day in exhaustion. She returned home before 7:30, and she had dinner with her mother, her brother, and Furs. She enjoyed a limited amount of relaxation. At midnight, she washed up and walked to the bedroom window. She grabbed the curtain and prepared to draw it. During this process, Zio naturally cast her gaze outside and discovered that the crimson moon in the sky had already turned bigger at some point in time. Furthermore, the color had clearly deepened as though it was flowing blood. Blood moon. Zio suddenly turned her head and looked next door in concern. She was a little worried about her good friend's condition. However, she quickly recalled that Furs was a Sequence 4 demigod and no longer feared the effects of the full moon ravings. In the room next door, Furs was lying in bed, taking in the blood moon outside. As she endured the pain of her head being pricked by needles, she heard Mr. Dorr say, although going from Sequence 3 to Sequence 2 is indeed a qualitative change, going from an incomplete mythical creature to a real mythical creature, I believe that Sequence 4 to Sequence 3 has a qualitative change as well. It can even be said that Sequence 3 is the best level in a Beyonder pathway. At this level, there is no need to rely on external forces to resist the madness and the inclination towards losing control. There is no need to endure the torment every second and minute. They will also possess beyonder powers that completely exceed that of an ordinary person. They will be more godlike than they are human. Furthermore, they can obtain a small number of anchors and stabilize their mental state. If not for the fact that most Sequence 3 Beyonders don't have long enough lives, with it being difficult for them to live to more than 500 years old. I believe there won't be many saints who have the motivation to advance to an angel. Yeah. Furs nodded, indicating that she had already understood. At the same time, her forehead twitched slightly and she yawned secretly. She was already a little accustomed to the pain from her direct conversation with Mr. Dorr. Mr. Dorr continued, the apprentice pathways Sequence 3 is Wanderer. This means that the spirit world can no longer trap you. You can enter the cosmos, travel the astral world, head to different planets, and see true dead silence, true barrenness, true magnificence, and completely different civilizations. Only after experiencing it for yourself will you understand how insignificant the world you live in is. Mr. Dorr briefly explained his experiences as a showcase of the magnificence and beauty of the cosmos, displaying the stateliness and charm of different civilizations. This made Furs fall into a trance. If not for the sharp throbbing pain in her head still reminding her, she would have even forgotten that the speaker was a dangerous king of angels. As long as you help me escape, I'll give you the potion formula and beyonder characteristic of a wanderer and help you complete the ritual. Of course, this can be paid in advance. At the end of the full moon ravings, Mr. Dorr gave another promise. It really makes me look forward to it, Furs marveled sincerely. When Mr. Dorr's voice gradually weakened and disappeared, Furs suddenly pulled out the pillow at her waist and lay down. In less than 3 minutes, she fell asleep in peace. To her, the vast cosmos was indeed filled with charm. However, it also contained the danger of being corrupted just from knowing about it. She had no motivation to explore it. I'll consider it after touring all the places in the northern and southern continent and the 5 seas. In her sleep, Furs muttered almost silently to herself. At that moment, the blood-red moon outside the window had already faded. It returned to a light crimson color and wasn't full. A huge blood-colored moon hung on the edge of the cliff, illuminating the swamp below. The swamp was dark red and constantly bubbling, as though lava was boiling at the bottom of it. At a glance, there was no end to the swamp, like a vast ocean. Pa! A stone fell from the edge of the cliff and into the swamp. In the next second, a bubble appeared and silently burst, producing a blood-stained infant. The baby staggered, swam towards the cliff, and attempted to climb up. Pa! The stone beneath Emlyn White's feet shattered as he fell off the cliff and into the swamp. This sanguine Earl suddenly jolted awake from his dream. He looked around in horror and confusion. After confirming that this was his room, where there were many extremely familiar dolls of different sizes, Emlyn slowly exhaled and said to himself with a rather solemn expression, that dream wasn't simple. As a shaman king, he had a good understanding of a dreamscape. Could this be the so-called divine revelation? But I didn't receive any revelations. Emlyn thought for a few seconds but couldn't come up with an answer. Then, he decided to ignore the problem and prepare to ask Father Yutravsky when he had the time. The incomplete moon that had its blood-red colors faded illuminated the garden of the Cathedral of Waves. Alger reached out his hand to grab the note delivered by the gale and read it. Verdun is looking for a pirate ship or a smuggling ship to Bansi. Bansi harbor had yet been rebuilt, and there were no liners from all over the world that headed there. Verdun, who treasured his limited teleportation opportunities, could only rely on extremely normal methods. Head to Bansi? Alger immediately frowned. He knew what Bansi meant, but he didn't understand why Verdun wanted to go to Bansi. There should be nothing there. No, even if the church has leveled Bansi, there's still something abnormal about it. Furthermore, the church didn't investigate what problems Bansi had hidden in the past. As a cardinal, Alger was qualified to read through some confidential documents, including the records of the actions that the Church of the Lord of Storms had done when dealing with Bansi. In addition, he had also learned more from Mr. Fool and the World Gairman Sparrow. After some thought, Alger quickly came to a decision. He planned on getting his shadow guard to arrange a pirate ship for Verdun. In this aspect, Alger knew many key people to aid him. It didn't need him to show his face in person or use his name. Of course, smuggling ships in the Rörsted archipelago were often equivalent to pirate ships. Chapter 1335. I'm sitting on the chair in a police station, looking at the mouths of two men in black and white checkered uniforms opposite me. It's like they're talking about something. The man on the left has a cold expression on his face, as if he has been through too many unfortunate events. The man on the right is a little inexperienced, and there's a hint of pity in his eyes. I don't feel any pain, nor did I regret delivering that final stab. At that moment, I even felt that I had been liberated. The warm blood that sprayed on my body was like salvation from a god. I only regret my fervent pursuit of money in my youth. I had sacrificed my dignity, my body, and my freedom. Over the past few days at the police station, I've had enough peace and quiet. I had the opportunity to ponder this question at a deeper level, far deeper than whatever that I've been thinking about over the years. Me having a weak will and being immature were the source of the mistakes I made. But they weren't the only reason. Ever since I was a child, all the education I received told me that working and striving hard is for that big house, those full floor-to-ceiling windows that let in plenty of light, to have more than 3 servants, a lawn and garden that I can call my own, silver-plated or even gold-plated cutlery, be able to host a banquet filled with delicacies, run balls that were filled with melodious music, etc. The newspapers and magazines I'd read also told me over and over again that only those that showed a sufficient level of decency can be called middle class. They are the true pillars of support for this kingdom. They are people of high class, excellence, zero mediocrity, and integrity, while having compassion and knowledge. At the same time, they also told me what decency was. It's wearing a beautiful dress, matching expensive skincare products, cosmetics, and exquisite fashion handbags for different occasions. It was to attend concerts, high tea, and gatherings filled with class. And all of this translated means gold pounds, and gold pounds. I have to admit that pursuing a better life is instinctual for everyone. However, when the influences on a girl tells her in every aspect that, when the mainstream views of society are all about appearance, exquisiteness, and elegance, it's very difficult to not have her thoughts become influenced. I don't know what this phenomenon is called. I only know that if all of this can't be changed, then a tragedy like mine will continue happening more and more often. When that happens, someone would definitely curse. Look at these gold-digging women, selling out their souls. Subconsciously, I turn around and see the beautiful and bustling world outside. I see the bright red blood flowing in this world. Miss Tracy, are you listening to us? A voice distracts my thoughts, coming from the slightly inexperienced policeman. I grin at him, not telling him I'm thinking about some philosophical questions. What a joke. A gold digger who sold her soul is actually thinking of such inane matters when she's being interrogated by the police. The policeman nods and says to me, Miss Tracy, you'll be put on trial soon. We'll arrange a lawyer for you. I'm sorry, we didn't manage to retain the witness. Just having his testimony isn't in your favor. It's okay, I say quietly to him. I will try my best to defend myself, and repent for the crimes I have committed. I only hope that I can restart life anew. I think for a moment and curl the corners of my lips. I say to the 2 officers, can you borrow a few books from the library for me while I wait to go on trial? Yes, phenomena of sociology and education. At that moment, I see the 2 police officers in a daze, and a hint of, yes, surprise. I sit at the far end of the model table and hear Miss Judgment describe the Utopia incident. After she finishes, I look around and hoarsely say, this is a ritual. Unsurprisingly, I see Miss Judgment's gaze freeze. I can sense Mr. Hanged Man and Miss Justice looking over with a hint of speculation in their eyes. At this moment, I can almost guess what they're thinking. They definitely suspect that this is the World Gehrman Sparrow's Sequence 1 ritual. And they are already long aware from the talks in the tarot gatherings that the existence of a Sequence 0 true god makes it impossible for a Sequence 1 to exist. Regarding this matter, I have already prepared an explanation. It is to let them think about the ancient sun god and his 8 kings of angels. Unfortunately, no one raises any questions. They may have already made the connection to the kings of angels, or perhaps they believe that the ritual involving Utopia is mainly to help Mr. Fool awaken further. I look at the lady who is lost in thought, and I ask after some deliberation, "Miss Tracy, where do your parents live?" "They've already passed away," the beautiful lady whose soul no longer belongs here replies with an ethereal voice. I lower my head and record it. "Do you have any other relatives?" The lady turns to look out the window and answers casually, "No." I exchange looks with my colleague and raise my voice. "Miss Tracy, are you listening to us?" The lady opposite me retracts her distant gaze and smiles at me. I don't know what she's thinking about. She's so quiet, like a flower blooming alone in the night. This analogy comes from an anthology of poems. My brother told me that reading poems makes me more charming. Of course, up till now, the poems have only brought mostly mockery. All of the police officers believe that it's worthless. When I tell the lady opposite me about the trial, I see a faint smile on her face as she pleads us to borrow a few books from the library, ones that I believe are difficult just from the title. The smile and the names of the book combine together into an indescribable beauty. After sending Miss Tracy back to the temporary detention room, I pack up the materials for the case and prepare to pay a visit to the lawyer. It's something that had been predetermined long ago. I lean back in my chair and listen to the Moon Emlyn describe his dream. After Father Yutravsky's appraisal, this dream has been confirmed to have not originated from the Earth Mother. This inevitably makes people cast their looks of suspicion at the moon, towards a state prior to being corrupted by the mother goddess of depravity. I'm nearly amused by my own thoughts. As an experienced seer, a master at deciphering dreams, I'm not held back by modesty. I frankly reveal what I know. The 3 possibilities are that this dreamscape is trying to bait you into exploring and pursuing something. To a certain extent, it can interfere with your fate. Secondly, this dreamscape hopes that you can interpret it deeply and understand it. Then, through this, corrupt you in an indiscernible manner. Thirdly, you are too worried about the matter of becoming a beauty goddess, so you dreamed of that remarkably terrifying scene. The third possibility doesn't need elaborating on. The action needed for the first 2 possibilities are the same: don't think about it, don't investigate. There's no need to leave Backlund. With that said, I see Emlyn nod without any hesitation. I know it's his way of handling things. A murder case? I browse the information on the case in my hand, and I use the changes in the tone of my voice to express my doubts. You should hire a senior lawyer. I'm just a solicitor, and strictly speaking, I don't have the right to represent anyone in court. Of course, this is only in the strictest of cases, but in reality, that never happens. As long as the case isn't too serious and doesn't involve the criminal courts, a solicitor can provide assistance to the court. The policeman in a black and white checkered uniform opposite me says with a smile, "Utopia is only a small city. We don't have senior lawyers, we'll have to hire them from elsewhere. Besides, this case is a case of self-defense. The sentence period will be very short, and the monetary aspect of this case doesn't even exceed £400. The trial can be done at the magistrate courts. When self-defense is deemed invalid, it'll be handed over to the criminal courts." He knows plenty. Is he planning on switching professions to become a lawyer? However, in normal circumstances, he still has to hand a homicide case that has unjustifiable self-defense to the criminal courts. Heh, this is the benefit of a small city. There are many things that aren't that strict. I think for a moment and reply tersely, "I'll try defending the client by claiming innocence. Also, please arrange for me to meet Miss Tracy as soon as possible." After flipping through the information from before, I'm already quite confident in this case. The biggest problem now is whether Miss Tracy's image can lead to the sympathy of others. Yes, although my solicitor license was forged from elsewhere, this cannot deny my professionalism. It just so happened that I made mistakes on that examination. Bansi? Verdeux wants to go to Bansi? I sit at the bottom end of the long, model table and look at the hanged man who has reported to Mr. Fool. I have some doubts about the development of the matter. Verdeux, who's engrossed in mysticism and is trying to save Mr. Dorr, does have certain reasons to search Bansi Harbor. Furthermore, he has stayed in Biyao for almost half a year, so it's very normal for him to come into contact with information about Bansi. The main problem is that the hanged man's previous surveillance didn't provide any corresponding signs, making Verdeux's actions seem a little out of place. The importance placed on this matter has to be raised. I nod inwardly and hear Mr. Fool instruct, continue monitoring. I play the 7-string guitar by the fountain in the municipal square. I use my knife and fork to slice the steak. In the cathedral, I describe the teachings of the goddess to the believers. I reach out my right hand and leave the carriage with the help of a gentleman. I get the new dress I had been eyeing for so long, and I can't wait to change into it. I stride forward with my 4 legs as I'm being chased by a child. I laugh loudly as I totter about and play with a dog. Suddenly, we tremble. We look up into the sky and see illusory, thin lines drilling out from our bodies. They extend to an infinite height, extending beyond the grayish-white fog. They extend into an ancient palace and land in the hands of a tall figure shrouded in fog. During this period of time, Klein's state had always been very strange, as though he had completely transformed into thousands of lives. Every clone had their own will, thoughts, knowledge, and fate. However, above this collective consciousness was a primary consciousness that held control. It constantly suffered all kinds of attacks, as though it could be assimilated by the sea of consciousness that had been formed autonomously at any moment. However, it eventually withstood the barrage of attacks, allowing Klein to maintain a certain level of clarity. His true body had been lying underground in St. Ariana Cathedral. His consciousness would occasionally rise and enter Sapphira Castle, and occasionally sink into his body. All the scenes that the marionette clones experienced constantly flashed in his mind like a dream formed from large amounts of fragments. Chapter 1336 Interaction Backlund Steam Locomotive Station, Platform 3. Alfred chatted with his parents and sister for a while before rushing to leave the train during the gap in between. He came to the platform and said to his squire, "Give me an East Balham cigarette." If the past few years had any negative impact on him, other than his mental suffering and pain, he still retained a few bad habits. After smoking plenty of East Balham cigarettes that consisted of spices and herbs wrapped in roasted tobacco leaves, Alfred was no longer used to the paper cigarettes that remained popular in the northern continent. He believed that they were bland and tasteless, as though they were liquor diluted with water. As for cigars, he felt that it needed a good environment to slowly savor it. It didn't suit his present situation. Of course, his smoking addiction wasn't too serious. A disciplinary paladin had a good enough constitution and spirit to resist such influences. Alfred came to the platform to smoke because he felt that it was too stuffy in the train carriage. Besides, his mother often raised the issue of him not being married. After the squire took it out and lit the East Balham cigarette, Alfred brought the stick that was nearly charred black to his mouth and sucked it deeply. The strong smell entered his body, causing his spirit to jolt. At that moment, he saw a blonde-haired man who looked like a classic sculpture walking over with his valet. Alfred hesitated and smiled. He raised his right hand and said, "Hibbert, I thought you wouldn't be returning to East Chester." It was Earl Hall's eldest son, Alfred's brother, Lord Hibbert Hall. Hibbert drew a perfect smile and said, "I'm just a cabinet secretary, not the cabinet chief secretary. I won't be so busy that I don't even have the weekend off." In fact, he had no plans on being a cabinet chief secretary either. His main goal was to accumulate experience at the various departments in the government and build up his own networks and resources to prepare for entering the House of Lords in the future. Alfred took another puff of the East Balham cigarette and smiled. Happy weekend. After watching Hibbert enter the carriage, Alfred sensed that someone was looking over and was discussing. Why aren't there any passengers waiting for that train carriage? It doesn't seem to be full. That's a special carriage. It was pre-booked by an important figure for a large sum of money. I know that you might not have seen such a situation before, but you have to remember that this happens frequently in big cities like Backlund and Constant. When those important figures bring their entire family out, they will definitely have more than 100 servants follow. Perhaps there might even be pets, so how can they squeeze in a train carriage with ordinary people? Is that so? I wonder who is this big shot. Alfred turned his head to look. There were dozens of people in gray-blue uniforms on Platform 2 who were quietly surveying Platform 3 across the empty tracks. The distance between the two parties wasn't small. If Alfred's hearing wasn't outstanding, he wouldn't be able to figure out what they were discussing. They are? Alfred turned to ask his adjutant. He could only recognize that the uniform they were wearing belonged to a railway company. The adjutant turned around immediately and asked the staff at the platform. Soon, he jogged back and whispered to Alfred, "General, they're train dispatchers from all over the kingdom. They're undergoing short-term training in Backlund." Alfred nodded slightly and glanced at the Platform 2 again. The oldest of the train dispatchers had white hair and the youngest looked to be in their early 20s. Most of them were middle-aged men in their 30s or 40s with gray sideburns. In the Sonia Sea, city of generosity, Biyao, Verdun carried his luggage, which didn't contain many valuables, and boarded the boat at night. He left the harbor and boarded a pirate ship. As a Sequence 7 of the Apprentice Pathway, he wasn't very good at combat. And even though Verdun had a mystical item with him, he was rather afraid of its negative effects. He wasn't willing to use it unless it was critical to do so. Therefore, in order to avoid danger, he tried his best not to bring anything that would easily attract the greed of pirates which he didn't trust. The pirate on the deck glanced at Verdun and scoffed. "There's no need to be afraid. We always keep our promises. As long as you pay for the journey, we definitely won't throw you into the sea. Here, it'll be even safer than you taking a passenger ship. At least you don't have to worry about encountering pirates." Seeing Verdun silent as though he appeared somewhat afraid, the pirate gleefully threw a key to him. The second floor on deck, the room at the end. Verdun caught the brass key and entered the cabin. He climbed up the stairs and headed down the corridor. This level seemed to be specially prepared for the people who boarded the pirate ship for various reasons. Along the way, Verdun encountered a few passengers that were totally unlike pirates. Among them was a street girl who was dressed rather scantily, a middle-aged man with a protruding belly and oily faces, an extremely cold young man wearing a cloak and a top hat. "Do you want to join me?" the lady smiled and asked when she saw Verdun looking over. She fluttered her eyes at him as she asked. It wasn't clear if she was planning to do some business on the trip, or if she was doing business while happening to make a trip. Verdun ignored her and withdrew his gaze before walking to his room. That well-defined and cold young man also stopped at the entrance diagonally opposite. "Backlund, Westborough, 9 Bellotto Street." "Come in." Zio straightened her body from the huge, wide seat. The door creaked open, and 2 MI9 members who were under Zio walked in. "Colonel, we found some information regarding the investigation of Utopia." A man in a dark-colored jacket handed Zio a report. Zio was startled as she perked up. "What is it?" The man in a dark-colored jacket simply said, "In the past few days, we took advantage of the free time we had from completing our previous mission, to visit all the passengers in Backlund from that particular steam locomotive through our informants." Without a doubt, he was referring to the steam locomotive that had stopped at Utopia. "Okay." Zio nodded and gestured for her subordinate to continue. The man in a deep jacket pointed at the report and said, "We have preliminary confirmation that none of the passengers that successfully arrived in Backlund show any abnormalities. They're in good spirits and have no problems with their memories. However, we discovered something. At that time, not everyone returned to the train. According to 2 passengers, their neighbors chose to remain in Utopia. One was a lady who loves traveling and exploration. She has a deep love for foreign places. After witnessing the outstanding red wine, desserts, and unique fizzling iced tea in Utopia, she decided to give up on her original plans and stayed in this small unique city for a while longer to discover even more wonderful things. The two passengers learned about this when they were chatting with her. Not only did they share neighboring seats, but they also chose to stay in the same hotel. They met in the morning. That hotel happened to be the same one our intelligence agent stayed in. It's called Iris's. Xiao slowly nodded and said, "Have you investigated the lady's situation? What's her name?" "No, we can't be sure if she has left Utopia," answered the other MI9 member with a bushy goatee. Those two passengers only know that lady's name is Monica, but they don't know her last name or background. Xiao tersely acknowledged. "Your subsequent mission is to investigate this lady's background, find her family and friends, and confirm if she has returned." "Yes, Colonel." The two MI9 personnel saluted and left Xiao's office. Xiao read the report they had submitted and sighed silently. Compared to her subordinates, she was actually closer to the truth of Utopia. She already knew that it was a ritual that had a certain connection with Gehrman Sparrow. However, she had no way of reporting this news to her superiors for credit. Without mentioning the origins of the information, Xiao needed to consider whether Gehrman Sparrow was willing to let this news leak out. "Perhaps I can try contacting Gehrman Sparrow and ask him for his opinion." Xiao tidied her desk in thought and left MI9. After changing her clothes, she returned to East Borough and the bridge area. She headed to different bars, just like back in her bounty hunter days, to gather all sorts of information from different people. During this process, she asked about Utopia in passing, but no one had heard of it. Finally, Xiao entered a bar located in the Backlund Bridge area and sat on a high stool. She said to the bartender, "Anyone suspicious recently?" "A lot of people are suspicious, but they don't have any bounty," the bartender replied casually. Xiao circled around this topic for more information, and when done, she asked according to plan, "Have you heard of Utopia?" "I've heard of it," the bartender replied as he wiped the glass. Xiao moved her gaze from the bar counter up slowly. She looked at the bartender and asked, "Where from?" "There was a guest who came earlier, and he controlled his drinking," the bartender said indifferently. "I promoted our specialty cocktail to him. He said that he has other things to do, so he could only drink a glass of beer. I praised him and asked where he came from. He said, Utopia." Wendell had just finished his breakfast when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw a police officer in a black and white checkered uniform standing outside. He opened the door in puzzlement. "Might I ask what's the matter?" Wendell asked politely. This house was a place he had been assigned to after coming to Backlund. This was because he would be staying in this city for quite some time, receiving internal investigations and monitoring. The police officer was still young and a little inexperienced. He was only in his early 20s. He forced a smile and said to Wendell, "Hello, I'm Biles, a police officer. There's a case that requires you to provide testimony in court." "What case?" Wendell frowned slightly. The young policeman named Biles said with a polite smile, "It's the Tracy homicide case in Utopia." Wendell's eyes widened. Chapter 1337. A chain reaction. At that moment, Wendell felt his calves tremble slightly, as if he could no longer support the weight of his body. After leaving Utopia, he had anticipated the worst possible outcome, sudden death with no explicable reason. However, he never expected that he would meet someone from Utopia in Backlund, a real large city. More importantly, the visitor had even invited him to Utopia. To Wendell, this was an extremely scary nightmare. Him not experiencing a mental breakdown could only be attributed to his good mental fortitude. Keeping his composure, Wendell forced a troubled expression and said, "I've had plenty of things to do recently." The police officer named Biles immediately said, "The trial will happen in 2 weeks. Here's the subpoena." As he spoke, he handed the document to Wendell. Frankly speaking, Wendell didn't want to accept it at all, but he had no choice but to accept it. Biles took a step back. This concerns the future of a lady. I sincerely hope that you can testify in court. It depends on the situation. Wendell didn't want to agree or refuse. Biles didn't say anything else as he bowed. I'll wait for you in Utopia. I hope we meet again. With that said, he turned around and left the residence, entering the street. Throughout the entire process, Wendell seemed to have been frozen into an ice sculpture, standing there without blinking. After another 10 seconds, he finally woke up from his nightmare. He collapsed to the side weakly and held himself up by placing his right hand to the door. Just now, he had been so afraid that Biles would forcefully bring him back to the non-existent Utopia. If that happened, Wendell didn't know if he still had a chance to leave. Perhaps, he would disappear forever. Compared to sudden death, this impossible to predict but clearly negative outcome left him even more fearful. I need to quickly report this matter to the brass. Capture that policeman from Utopia and find out the real situation of this bizarre town and a suitable way to resolve the problem completely. Wendell snapped back to his senses and tried his best to perk himself up. He prepared to inform the MI9 members who were secretly monitoring him. At this moment, he finally realized that there was a huge problem with his response. He didn't grab the opportunity to inform his monitoring colleagues with a hand gesture that the police officer who had visited him was problematic. He didn't try to stall for time either. Instead, he waited for the monitors to realize that something was wrong. He also didn't show his talent as an intelligence agent, asking surreptitiously Biles which hotel he stayed in Backlund and what day he was setting off by train. He was so terrified that he could only subconsciously use a response that wouldn't create an accident. With that thought in mind, Wendell walked out of the door and looked in the direction where Biles had left, but he didn't even see his figure. This police officer from Utopia had already blended into the carriages and pedestrians. Retracting his gaze, Wendell looked down at the subpoena in his hand and suddenly felt a little uneasy. What will happen if I don't go to Utopia to testify 2 weeks later? The more Wendell thought about it, the more scared he became. His calves weakened again, and he hurriedly made a hand gesture to inform his colleagues that were hiding around him of the anomaly. Westboro, 9 Bellotto Street. After learning that a Utopia resident had arrived in Backlund, Zio was both shocked and confused. According to her previous observations, Utopia was likely located in a secret location, or somewhere between real and illusory, allowing outsiders to enter through random entrances. As for why they wanted outsiders to enter, it was probably a ritual requirement. Therefore, according to Zio's understanding, the people of Utopia likely wouldn't leave their hometown and wander around. This is also a ritual requirement? What's the true identity of these residents? Mr. Fool's believers, the world German Sparrow's companions? After Zio asked about the general appearance of the Utopia visitor, she had no choice but to return to MI9's headquarters due to the lack of further information. She hesitated on whether she should send her subordinates to perform a large-scale search. She wasn't sure if Mr. World would be happy to see such actions being taken, and she was afraid of affecting the ritual. After pacing back and forth in the office, Zio prepared to pray to Mr. Fool and ask him to transfer her questions to the world German Sparrow. As she walked to the chair, Zio swept her gaze across the report placed on the table. It was an investigation report that her 2 subordinates had prepared. On the one hand, they had confirmed that there were no problems with the passengers that successfully arrived in Backlund. On the other hand, they had pointed out that there were passengers who had remained in Utopia. Passengers. Zio's eyes narrowed as she made a guess based on her intuition. That Utopia inhabitants had their own goals in coming to Backlund, and it wasn't for a random trip. And his goal is very likely related to a particular passenger who has left Utopia. This. Zio was alarmed as she hurriedly sat down and attempted to pray. Just then, someone knocked on her office door. "Please come in," Zio said after some hesitation. As the door opened, Zio saw the goateed Locke and Wendell, who was in charge of the Utopia incident. "Colonel, Wendell met someone from Utopia. He paid him a visit directly," Locke said, fumbling over his words. This development was equally unexpected. Indeed. Xiao wasn't surprised. Instead, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. She looked at Wendell and asked, "Why did he visit you?" "He requested that I head to Utopia to testify about the homicide case I mentioned in my report." Wendell was clearly calmer than before. He then added, "He's a policeman. Name's Biles. I don't dare ask where he was living. I don't know when he's planning to leave or which steam locomotive he's planning on taking to leave." To express the weight she had on this matter, Xiao stood up and thought. "Locke, summon your team members to look for the rental carriage drivers who often prowl for customers around Wendell's residence, as well as the carriage drivers who passed by the nearby district, and ask if they've seen Biles before. If they have seen him, ask them where he was sent to. Also, send someone to the steam locomotive station and wait by the entrance to observe the passengers." After instructing her subordinates, Xiao turned to look at Wendell. "Cooperate with them and sketch out Biles." "Yes, Colonel," Locke and Wendell replied in unison. After they left and closed the door, Xiao sat back down and began to pray. Soon, she received Mr. Fool's response and saw the World Gehrman Sparrow praying in the gray fog. Gehrman Sparrow told her, "You can carry out normal investigations. When necessary, you can suggest that it's a ritual, but it must be included among a few options." Xiao immediately heaved a sigh of relief as she patiently waited for her subordinates to report the results of their investigations. As night fell, Locke returned to Bellotto Street and reported to Xiao, "We found the rental carriage driver that took the Utopian's business." "Oh." Xiao showed her concern. Locke explained simply, that Utopian originally got the carriage driver to go to the dock area. However, as soon as the carriage entered the corresponding area, he requested to get off, saying that they had arrived. That street was very unfamiliar to the carriage driver, making him feel like he was lost. After leaving that street, he realized that his surroundings had become familiar. Our men accompanied him to that place again, but he couldn't find that street no matter what. Xiao nodded slightly and said solemnly, "It matches our preliminary descriptions regarding the entrances and exits of Utopia." "Colonel, are you saying that one can enter or leave Utopia from any city and street?" Locke was in disbelief. Xiao thought for a moment before saying, "From the looks of it, yes. But I have a feeling that there's something wrong." How does Utopia connect to different places? What does it rely on?" As her voice trailed off, Xiao said to Locke, "Tell Wendell that he'll spend the following 2 weeks here until that subpoena expires." "Yes, Colonel." Locke turned around and left Xiao's office. Wendell didn't have any objections to Colonel Dericha's arrangements. He could even say that he would only feel safe inside MI9's headquarters. His temporary residence was a simply refurbished duty room. Through the window, he could see the lawn, garden, and trees outside. At a glance, Wendell saw a pitch-black raven standing on a tree branch, silently looking over. Night in Bansi was abnormally creepy. From time to time, the cries of ravens or other seabirds could be heard. Verdun stood at the window, watching the approaching dilapidated dock and the city that had already been reduced to ruins. The pressure in his heart grew. After a few days at sea, the ship he boarded was about to reach Bansi harbor. The captain had already informed Verdun in the morning that they would only wait for 2 hours. If he exceeded the 2 hours, Verdun could only wait for the next ship on this deserted island. Who knew when the next ship would come? After taking a deep breath, Verdun retracted his gaze and took off his coat. Then, he opened his suitcase, took out a classic black robe, and put it on. The surface of the robe was embroidered with golden and silver threads, and there were many gems the size of rice grains attached to it. It was a sealed artifact of the Abraham family. After making preparations, Verdun left the pirate ship and entered Bansi harbor. Along the way, the ancient robe tightened, causing his face to turn purple as he nearly fainted. As they walked, Verdun found the spot where the telegraph office stood based on the map he had bought. In the middle of the rubble, there were 2 bloody red marks, ones that remained fresh. It was as if they were left behind after 2 people were crushed into minced meat. Beside the two figures, on a broken wall, there was an octopus-headed monster wearing armor. It stood on waves and was holding a trident. Verdure raised the lantern in his hand high and was about to take a closer look when he suddenly felt a drop of cold liquid land on his neck. Gripped with terror, he subconsciously reached out his hand. He found it sticky, nothing like rain. It was colorless. Not blood. It's a little similar to saliva. Verdure's forehead twitched slightly and he slowly raised his head to look at the place where the drop of liquid could have dripped from. It was a swath of pitch black. It was the night sky without the moon or stars. Chapter 1338 Exploration. Verdure subconsciously swallowed his saliva, feeling an indescribable sense of fear. He didn't know what he was afraid of. There wasn't any real danger, yet, a drop of unknown liquid falling from above was enough to chill his spine and tighten his pores. Perhaps it was because the environment was too eerie and silent, or perhaps it was because of the identity and unknown origins of the liquid. Verdure cautiously moved 2 steps outside and patiently observed. In the next few minutes, nothing abnormal happened. No more liquid fell from above. This made Verdure suspect that it was only a bird passing by. There was a freshwater fish from the island streams or a sea fish in its mouth and a slightly sticky liquid dripped from its surface. He calmed himself and then checked on the ruins of the telegraph office. 10 minutes later, Verdure confirmed that there were only traces of blood and simple murals that were related to mysticism. It was worth researching. He didn't rashly extract samples of the blood-colored soil or make copies of the strange mural. Instead, he took out a pure dreamy crystal ball from his pocket. As an astrologer, he naturally had to use his best techniques to confirm if he should take action. Holding the crystal ball in his left hand, his right hand touched the top of the crystal ball as Verdure entered the state of an astrologer. In the next second, the crystal ball shone brightly. Bang! It exploded and scattered shards in every direction. Verdure's gaze froze. He stood rooted to the ground, completely ignoring the pain brought to him by the shards piercing into his body. It exploded, it actually exploded, he muttered to himself in disbelief. The crystal ball shards that stabbed into his body didn't seem to break through the classic robe. At that moment, they fell without any blood on them. Of course, there were a few shards left on Verdure's jaw and face, peppering them with small wounds. Who is it? Verdure suddenly came to his senses and turned to face another direction. In the ruins opposite him, a figure walked out. It was the woman in scantily clad clothes from the pirate ship. She had hidden herself very well and wasn't discovered by Verdure. However, the explosion from the crystal ball gave her a fright and made her react excessively, causing her to fail to maintain her hidden state. Verdure's injured face immediately twisted. "Why are you here?" The lady curled her lips and put on an indifferent attitude. "This is Bansi Harbor, not your home." "Why can't I be here?" "I felt bored and came down to take a stroll, hoping to pick up some jewelry from the ruins." "Is there any problem with that?" She retorted with a few questions without any intention of distancing herself from Verdure. Verdure didn't argue with her. He took out the medicine and medical alcohol that he had prepared beforehand and treated his facial and chin injuries. He then pulled out the crystal ball shards and put them back into his pocket. He didn't want his blood to remain in such a strange place. Following that, Verdure pulled on an accessory on the classic robe. It was a door-shaped symbol formed from 3 rubies, 3 emeralds, and 3 diamonds. In an instant, the long robe tightened, accentuating the flesh on Verdure's body. Just as Verdure's bones were about to be crushed, his figure gradually faded and he disappeared. Then, he teleported to the coastal mountain outside Bansi Harbor. The mountain had collapsed and turned into rubble. According to what Verdure knew, this was once the place where the Bansi residents used to worship the god of weather. It was also the main target of the Church of Storms. After the crystal ball exploded to warn him that the Bansi telegraph office was hiding an unknown danger, Verdure didn't dare to continue exploring the area or search for mysticism materials. He could only forcefully move to the next location. and this allowed him to escape the woman's tailing. As soon as Wilder's figure appeared, he bent down and took a deep breath. It was as if he had finally recovered from his suffocating state. At the same time, Verdure felt a sharp pain in his right rib, as if a bone had fractured. After taking several deep breaths, he endured the pain and walked a few steps forward with sweat on his forehead, arriving at the altar marked on the map. Without a doubt, the altar had been destroyed. There was only a glassified, slightly charred crater. There was gravel with different shapes scattered around it. The gravel had traces of being engulfed in fire and lightning to various degrees. After Verdure Abraham surveyed the area, he raised his right hand and waved his sleeve. With a whoosh, a small portion of the gravel was pushed away from the spot, revealing the ground beneath it. This was a trickmaster's wind trick. Verdure used it to replace the need for manual labor to fully ensure his safety. As the gravel flew, Verdure saw the charred ground. There were a few parts left in some areas that had extremely incomplete patterns, drawings, and symbols. Woo! The sound of the wind grew more intense as it resonated in Verdure's ears, causing him to look up in surprise. The wind that could only blow small gravel had somehow turned into a hurricane. It even pushed him into a state of staggering about. Wild clouds gathered in the sky, as if a storm was brewing. Although he had heard that Bansi was a weather museum, he had never thought that the changes would happen so suddenly. For a split second, Verdure suspected that his wine trick had triggered a storm, or perhaps it had caused some changes to the cleared ruins of the altar. This guess made his forehead break out into a cold sweat. As the storm raged, Verdure saw the rubble in front of him fly up, revealing a boulder that was buried underneath. The surface of the boulder was crisscrossed with deep cracks, giving off a feeling that it would shatter once it was touched. At this moment, the wind had calmed down, but the heavy rain was still brewing. Thinking about how he was already in Bansi Harbor, and couldn't afford to be scared off just like that, he mustered up his courage and approached the boulder covered in charred black cracks. He then took out a magnifying glass that was engraved with strange patterns, and he seriously checked the state of the boulder. 7 to 8 minutes later, Verdure put away the magnifying glass, a mystical item, and sighed in regret and dismay. He had already confirmed that there was nothing wrong with the boulder. It didn't involve anything related to mysticism. Verdure was about to retract his gaze and leave when he suddenly saw that at the interface of the boulder's bottom and the earth, bright redness seeped out. The bright redness gradually expanded, like blood flowing out. However, it didn't spread into a huge area. It was limited to a very small area. The two blood-red figures in the telegraph office's ruins instantly flashed across Verdure's mind. His scalp couldn't help but tingle. His lips quickly turned dry as he instinctively thought that this wasn't a good development. After swallowing another mouthful of saliva, Verdure raised his right hand and created another gust of wind, causing quite a number of miniature rocks to roll over to fill the bottom of the boulder completely, covering up the bright redness that seeped out. He didn't stay here any longer. He forced himself to activate teleportation again and headed for his final destination. This time, another one of his ribs fractured again, causing him to almost faint from the pain. In addition to the suffocation caused by the tightening, Verdure felt like he was hovering around the edge of death. He took several seconds to recover and cast his gaze forward. This place was also in ruins. A collapsed house covered the weeds. According to a pirate who had once explored the ruins of Bansi, there was an item here worth researching. It was an ordinary wooden door, but it was the only thing that remained intact in Bansi. The pirate didn't find anything special about the wooden door, so he got his subordinate to carry it in an attempt to move it back to the ship. However, they had only taken 2 steps when they suddenly collapsed. Dragging their spines, their heads separated from their bodies and rolled to the side. This frightened the pirate. He didn't dare to stay any longer and led the rest of the crew away in a hurry. Verdure didn't fully believe the story that the other party had told him. Although he hadn't experienced much life at sea, he knew that the sailors liked to exaggerate, often exaggerating something several times. However, even if it was an exaggeration, Verdure believed that the door was worth studying. After a round of searching, he discovered his target. The ordinary-looking wooden door was leaning against a collapsed wall with brass locks and handles. There were no corpses around it, nor were there any traces of blood. It was identical to the majority of the ruins. Indeed, he's exaggerating. Perhaps the pirate heard about this wooden door from somewhere else. Both he and his subordinates didn't dare to move it. Verdun looked around and suddenly said, "Who is it? Why are you monitoring me?" He actually didn't notice anyone around him, but based on his experience and lessons, he could use words and a reaction to deceive the possible presence of a monitor. A second later, a middle-aged man with a belly appeared in the shadows. He said nothing and silently left the place. Verdun heaved a sigh of relief as he didn't waste any time to approach the wooden door. According to the information he had obtained, no matter which way he opened the wooden door, it wouldn't bring about any abnormal changes. There would be no danger if he didn't attempt to move it. After thinking for a few seconds, Verdun retracted his hand into his sleeve and used his classical robe as a glove to pull the wooden door up. He raised the wooden door, and the surroundings fell silent. Verdun pushed the wooden door like he was normally opening a door, but there were no changes. He tried many other methods, but he failed to make the wooden door display any abnormalities. It seemed to have just been lucky to be preserved in its entirety under the bombardment of the Church of the Lord of Storms. Taking a deep breath, Verdun tried to calm himself down. He thought for a moment and tried to open the door again. However, unlike before, he held the handle and gently twisted it down. After hearing the light click of metal colliding, Verdun pushed the wooden door backward and let it lean against a collapsed wall. This time, a grayish-white fog appeared before Verdun. In the fog, there was a faintly discernible street and a row of terraces. Outside one of the houses, there was a wooden signboard. On them were a few Loanese words, Bansi Harbor Telegraph Office. While Verdun's pupils dilated, a calm voice sounded from the telegraph office that was shrouded in fog. "Are you here to send a telegram? Please come in." Chapter 1339. Behind the door. Although the voice coming from the telegraph office wasn't anything out of the ordinary, it was just a little intermittent. It lacked the obvious changes in tone. Normally, it wouldn't strike terror in others, but Verdun's heart suddenly erupted with a surge of fear. It was like a bullet with flames shooting into an ammunition dump. It accurately hit a barrel of flammable gunpowder and ignited the fear that Verdun had accumulated and suppressed previously. The horror that swept into every corner of his body was like a hand that grabbed Verdun's heart and blanked out his brain. He turned around abruptly and ran frantically towards the remnant pier where the pirate ship was. During this process, Verdun had completely forgotten to think. He didn't remember wearing a classic robe that could teleport. All he did was run through the ruins with his feet, occasionally tripping over random items and falling heavily to the ground. Sometimes, his face would turn purple from his tightening clothes, and he had no choice but to stop to catch his breath. However, every time he composed himself a little, he would crawl up and continue running. He looked like he had lost his rationality and was acting purely on instinct. Without the force he provided, the wooden door couldn't maintain its balance. It slid down from the collapsed wall and fell to the floor covered with bricks. The grayish-white fog and the shadowy houses disappeared. After 5 minutes, Verdun ran back to the pier under the storm. His eyes were wide open, filled with panic and confusion. He didn't notice that there was a figure standing on the deck of the pirate ship, quietly looking down at him. This was the young man wearing a half-top hat and a long black trench coat. He had a cold expression. Verdun didn't even think about it and immediately used the gangway to return to the pirate ship. He rushed into the cabin and rushed to the second floor before rushing into his room. Bang! He slammed the door shut and curled up on the small, narrow bed. He wrapped himself tightly with the blanket and shivered. When another of his ribs fractured again, the excruciating pain struck him and he finally recovered from his horror. He realized that his limbs were sore and his body was hot. Every breath he took was like thunder. He struggled with all his might, and finally, he took off his classic robe and fell back into the bed. He felt dizzy and nauseous. The air just felt insufficient. Outside the cabin, the cold-looking man suddenly raised his hand. He took out a human-skinned glove and wore it on his left palm. Suddenly, the man vanished into thin air and appeared in a corner of the ruins. He appeared beside the ordinary wooden door. He bent down and raised the wooden door, allowing it to stand in front of the collapsed wall. Right on the heels of that, the man in the black trench coat mimicked Verdoux's actions. He reached out for the handle and twisted it downwards. Then, he pushed the wooden door forward and let it lean against the wall. Almost at the same time, he saw a grayish-white fog. He saw the faintly discernible streets and houses in the fog. Amidst the houses, the clearest, most eye-catching one was the Bansi Harbor Telegraph Office. The rest were more or less blurry. At this moment, the calm voice in the telegraph office asked through the door, "Who are you?" "I'm Gehrman Sparrow," the young man in a half-top hat replied in the same staccato. The interior of Bansi Harbor Telegraph Office suddenly fell silent as though someone was walking silently towards the door. At that moment, Gehrman Sparrow turned his head to the other side. In the deep end of the street, a figure walked over. He was wearing a straw hat and had a towel around his neck. He was bending over to pull something. As the figure approached, the outline of the object behind him gradually became clear. It was a black vehicle with 2 wheels. It had a roof that could block the scorching sun and rain. In the vehicle sat a lady wearing a waist-length dress with an embroidered fan. Both she and the driver were concealed by thick fog, making it difficult for anyone to see their exact appearances. When they passed Gehrman Sparrow, he barely managed to see a few details through the fog. The hunched man pulling the carriage had a rotten face with pale yellow pus flowing. In areas where the lady wasn't covered by the fan and clothes, her skin was swollen with a glisten amidst many blue and black spots. With a ring, a bell sounded. A blue train with 2 carriages sped out from in front of Gehrman Sparrow. At this moment, Gehrman Sparrow realized that there was an iron-black track on the ground. Above him were long lines. On the top of the train carriage, there was a rather complicated metal frame that slid over the long lines. Through the glass window of the train, Gehrman Sparrow saw the passengers inside. They faced the streets, but only their heads remained. Each head was dragging a bloody spine. Gehrman Sparrow's pupils dilated as he silently watched this scene without moving for a long time. After nearly a minute, he took a step forward in an attempt to enter the blurry street beneath the grayish-white fog. However, the fog blocked him. No matter what method he used, he couldn't pass through it. 15 minutes later, Gehrman Sparrow stopped his attempts and closed the wooden door, eliminating the fog. Then, he dragged the wooden door and teleported directly to the pirate ship. He wasn't worried about being cursed at all. He then placed the wooden door on the deck and reached out his left hand again to grab the door handle. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound from Gehrman Sparrow's neck. His head seemed to be raised by an invisible hand as it dragged out a bloody spine. Gehrman Sparrow's expression didn't change as he coldly raised his right hand and pressed it above his head, pressing his head back to its original position. Immediately after, he turned the handle as though unaffected and pushed the wooden door open again, allowing it to lean against the shipboard. However, this time, there was no grayish-white fog to be seen, nor were there any visible streets, houses, or trains. It could be said that there was nothing unusual. In the next second, the wooden door rapidly decayed, turning into a pile of mud, as if it was trying to avoid the fate of being tested. Gehrman Sparrow didn't stop it. He took out a golden ring embedded with a ruby and wore it for nearly 10 seconds. After the ring vanished, Gehrman Sparrow reached out with his right hand and pulled out the same ordinary wooden door from the void before continuing his attempts. After confirming that the wooden door would lose its effects once it left Bansi, Gehrman Sparrow casually waved his hand, allowing it to vanish in midair. 2 hours later, the dark clouds in the sky gradually dissipated. The storm that had been brewing for a long time ultimately did not descend. When the pirate ship was far away from Bansi Harbor, Verdou, who had finished treating his injuries, took a bottle of medicine and allowed himself to quickly fall asleep so that he could adjust his mental state. In the hazy dream world, he ran in a desolate moor, looking for something frantically, but he found nothing. Suddenly, Verdure heard a faint voice coming from deep in the moor, the great god of war. The symbol of iron and blood. The ruler of chaos and strife. This sentence repeated over and over again, but it didn't alarm Verdure enough to snap him out of his dreams. After some time, Verdure woke up and opened his eyes. At that moment, the morning sun shone into the cabin outside the window, bringing with it a faint light. Verdure slowly sat up and realized that he didn't need to use the powers of an astrologer to recall the 3 lines of the honorific name that he had heard in his dream. And his relatively rich mysticism knowledge told him that it was referring to a hidden existence at the level of a deity. Is this the result of the incomplete symbols and labels around the altar, or a result of me witnessing that street in the grayish-white fog? Verdure frowned and fell into deep thought. He didn't rashly attempt to recite that honorific name, because he knew how miserable people who had done something like that had died. God of War. Verdure vaguely remembered that he had seen this deity's name in a book in his family. He decided to do some research before considering how to deal with it later. Bansi Harbor, on the collapsed coastal mountain. Red, blazing white, or orange flames emerged from the crevices of the gravel, forming a figure. This figure was wearing a black blood-stained armor, with a half-grown fiery red hair. He looked young and handsome. There was a blood-colored mark on his glabella that resembled a flag. There were traces of decay on his face. It was none other than the Red Angel evil spirit, Sauron Einhorn Medici. If he didn't have Saphira Castle and an attendant of mysteries characteristic to allow his marionettes to run around the world without considering the limitations of distance, I wouldn't need to take such a roundabout route. The Red Angel evil spirit Sked, a mystery as to who he was speaking with. In midair, a raven landed on the top of a boulder. There was a circle of white on its right eye, and a human voice sounded from its mouth. You actually used him and not him. This isn't like your style. The Red Angel evil spirit chuckled. That's because he wishes others to call him as him, and not him. As he spoke, Sauron Einhorn Medici glanced at the raven. This form of yours looks cuter than your true self, don't you think? Lil Raven? The white-eyed raven replied without any hint of anger, your mockery is just like you. Still living in the previous epoch. The Red Angel evil spirit smiled and said, the developments have been rather smooth, and he has been fooled. However, I believe that even if he discovers it, he will probably turn a blind eye. For the 2 of you to become great old ones, Dor has to return. The hypocritical him might still be hesitating about whether to do it, because if he isn't careful, it will bring about a huge disaster. Huh, I like disasters. Lil Raven, when are you going to make your payment? If you don't have enough strength, I won't be able to gain the trust of the brainless Abraham. When he prays to you, said the white-eyed raven. If you're worried that such a state won't last long, I can parasitize a worm of time into your body and help you maintain it. There's no need to thank me. As he spoke, the raven spread its wings and disappeared into the vast night sky. The Red Angel evil spirit turned his head and, with the advantage of the terrain, wore a solemn expression as he looked down at the Bansi ruins. Chapter 1340 Travel Diaries. This small city called Utopia is intrinsically no different from the ones I had been to in the past. Be it the folk culture, the people, or architectural style, it follows very closely to the standard Lone styles. I've heard that the southern continent has many peculiar and unusual traditions. I hope that I can experience it myself one day. Of course, that's after East and West Balam's peace is restored. Speaking of which, the most special thing about this place is that the weather is always changing and there's always a storm. As a result, most people have umbrellas and raincoats that are smeared with Donningsman tree sap. The hotel attendant told me that for a person of a certain income level, which also has a need to work outdoors, they would have to save quite a sum of money to purchase a raincoat. Otherwise, the sickness would only take more away. There are no meteorologists here. I have no idea why there are so many changes in the weather here. I can only guess that it has something to do with it lining the sea and being close to places with hurricanes. Yes, there's a deep water harbor a few kilometers away from Utopia. However, they're lacking in manpower, and it isn't very well managed. It can only maintain its operations on a small scale. They don't have local newspapers either. After all, it's just a small city with a few thousand people. The paperboys mainly sell the Tussock Times, Desi Mirror, and Siwan News. The second reason I like this place is because many people in Utopia are optimistic and are very enthusiastic about life. When I wrote this down, a band happened to pass by outside the hotel. It's not a professional band, but a group formed purely from amateur enthusiasts. Among them, there are civil servants, law enforcement officers, solicitors, professional policemen, school teachers, candy factory workers, shop owners. Among them, those with the money are responsible for the larger musical instruments, such as cello, violins, and other difficult musical instruments. The lower and middle-class citizens use relatively simple instruments like 7-string guitars and harmonicas. On some rest days, they will walk the streets and set off from the municipal square. They will circle the city before returning to the St. Ariana Cathedral near the square. They call this a musical tour. In the tour, not only do they not reject other citizens from joining, but they even encourage them to sing or dance along with the procession. According to my observations, the participants are very happy and very satisfied as they freely express their love for life. This gives me a feeling of being full of vigor. I have to admit that it's very infectious. I've tried to join the tour, and I've forgotten my troubles in the revelry of music, dancing, and singing. I only remember happiness. They aren't on a tour today. Instead, they're showering their blessings to a newlywed couple at the cathedral. Speaking of weddings, what I don't understand the most is that it only has the Evernight Goddess's cathedral. One ought to know that in most of the kingdom, even in a small town, there would be at least 2 cathedrals, one belonging to the Evernight Goddess and the other, the Lord of Storms. Before today, I couldn't imagine that an ordinary town in the kingdom would only believe in one deity. However, this doesn't cause too much trouble for me. Before I turned 18, I could only believe in the Lord of Storms under the influence of my family. However, after I graduated from grammar school, I came to truly understand that the goddess is the most compassionate and benevolent deity. Back to the wedding, I participated in a wedding a couple of days ago. I discovered that Utopia has some special customs in this area. Out of all of them, what I admire the most is that when the priest pronounces them man and wife, the groom and bride will bow to each other. No one is superior in this relationship as they only sincerely express their gratitude to be able to spend the rest of their lives together. This might be an expression of equality between man and woman in the goddess's teachings. In addition, there will be some special games segments after the wedding. For example, let the groom and the bride publicly describe their love story. This may be a rather embarrassing matter for them, but to the guests, it's rather interesting. Yes, I think so too, but I definitely won't add similar segments to my wedding. At the wedding, I heard the best love story I've heard so far. If there's a chance, and if you my dear readers of this particular column enjoy it, I'll consider retelling it. Of course, I'll change the names and some details to prevent the couple from feeling troubled. The most important reason why I like Utopia is its food. The food here is very delicious. The limited number of restaurants are all very good, and the best is undoubtedly the attached restaurant to the Irises Hotel I'm staying at. Be it the most basic beef steak, fried pig chop, charcoal barbecued meat, spiced fried fish, or even more complicated, more difficult stewed mutton with peas, thick cream soup, butter potatoes, and roasted potato skin, all of them have reached the level of a master chef in the city. In addition, the chefs here are quite skilled in creating unique dishes and food. There are sweet and sour meat cubes, and grilled fish smeared with various condiments. In the staples that don't seem to allow for experimentation, the chefs of Utopia haven't given up. I've eaten all kinds of toasts in this city, yam, potatoes, butter, creamed, and ones with fruits. As long as I was willing to, I could make it so that I don't eat the same thing twice during the week. The best food of praise here is their desserts. Cream pudding, fruit pudding, black forest cakes, carrot cakes, milk cakes, muffins, egg tarts. I feel hungry writing this. This is the reason why I still don't wish to leave after staying here for a week. What I'm most worried about now is not my wallet but my weight. I'm glad that the hotel doesn't have a weight scale, and at the same time, I blame them for not including one. The red wine in Utopia is also rather outstanding. The only problem is that they lack the age to settle down. It seems like the vineyards around the city haven't realized this. Here, I need to seriously recommend a drink. Utopia's fizzling iced tea. It's very special, and it has an even more amazing experience besides the sweetness and bubbles. Every night, I would go for a stroll in the municipal square. That's also the place where most utopians like to go for entertainment. They have an extraordinary love for the pigeons. I met an artist at the municipal square. His name is Anderson. He's handsome, and his artistic skills are superb. Unfortunately, he's a mute. I also know another writer. His name is Alzu. It's a rather strange name. He said that he's writing a long novel and asked me to appraise the beginning. I won't comment on his novel, but I was just curious about a few familiar names at the beginning of the novel. It included Anderson, Wendy, oh yes, this is the boss of my favorite bakery. I raised this question, and Alzu told me very seriously that when a writer can't think of names for characters, it's very reasonable for them to use someone they know as reference. I agree. Since this column is too narrow to contain my thoughts, I'll end it here. Love, Charlotte. Monica put down her fountain pen and seriously read the manuscript twice. She changed certain words and any grammatical errors. She was a writer. She wasn't famous at first, so she could only rely on writing third-rate romance novels to maintain her life. After she changed her faith to the Evernight goddess, her father had almost cut off all ties with her. However, ever since Miss Furze Wall, who had written Stormwind Mountain Villa, established a travel column, and had received quite a warm response after the war, Monica had also started to write about her travels in some Backlund newspapers. This perfectly matched her hobby, and her hobby gave her a unique vitality to help her become a famous travel columnist. Charlotte was her pen name. After her writing dried completely, Monica specially wrote another copy and stuffed it into an envelope before affixing it with a stamp. After confirming that the address was correct, the black-haired lady with a Desi Bay style carried her handbag and left the hotel, heading to the Utopia post office. The post office was next to the telegraph office. Whenever Monica passed by the latter, she would always find it a waste. From her point of view, Utopia rarely needed to send telegrams. It was too extravagant to specially build a telegraph office. After sending the letter, Monica looked at the sky and walked towards the municipal square. When she arrived at the entrance of St. Ariana's Cathedral, she met Biles. He was a police officer. He had once questioned Monica at the Iris's hotel due to the homicide witness. Unfortunately, Monica didn't know that man named Wendell. After greeting each other with a nod, Monica entered the cathedral and found a seat. She listened quietly to the sermon of the priest named Townsend. This was a priest she found to be most clergyman-like ever since she changed her faith to the Evernight goddess. His hair was half white, and he spoke slowly and mellowly. His voice was deep and low, always calming down people without them realizing it. Monica closed her eyes and listened attentively to the sermon. East Chester County, in a forest belonging to the Hall family. Alfred, Hibbert, and Audrey led their respective foxhounds with their servants around the forest and chased after their prey. This was the first time the three of them had hunted together since they became adults. In front of their sister, Alfred and Hibbert had a great time, at least on the surface. And to Alfred, the biggest problem was how to control himself and not show that he was too extraordinary. Otherwise, if a disciplinary paladin were to join the hunt, no one else would have the chance. He knew that his sister was a Beyonder, but he also knew that a Sequence 7 Beyonder of the Spectator pathway didn't have any actual combat ability. As they chased their prey, they rushed out of the forest and saw a wheat field. "Where are we?" Audrey, dressed in hunting gear, asked casually. This was her first time hunting in this forest, and she didn't know where it led to. Hibbert wasn't too familiar with the area as well. He turned his head and said to his attendant, "Ask someone." As they waited, the three siblings laughed as they discussed their trophies. As for the golden retriever, Susie, she glanced at the foxhounds that wanted to get close to her and made them distance themselves. After a while, Hibbert's attendant returned and reported, "Sir, there's a village called Heartlark nearby." "Heartlark? That village with the dragon worship customs? I came here from somewhere else." Audrey was taken aback when she heard that. "You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."